Hey friend, pull your blanket a little closer tonight. Get comfortable, really comfortable, because what I am about to tell you is not something you will find in most history books. It is the story of the people history almost completely forgot. Imagine this. A king sits in his stone hall surrounded by candlelight and cold silence. His army is 3 days' march away. His enemy is moving, and the only thing standing between his kingdom surviving or crumbling into dust is one single person, somewhere out on a dark road riding through the night. Not a knight, not a general, not a prince, just a messenger. One ordinary person carrying a piece of folded parchment, and here is the thing that still gives me chills when I think about it. That one person, that single rider in the darkness, may have been more important to the fate of a kingdom than any army that ever marched. Think about every single moment in history that changed the world, a battle won or lost, a marriage that formed an alliance between two kingdoms, a treaty signed before blood was shed, a warning that saved 10,000 lives. Every single one of those moments depended completely and utterly on someone delivering a message in time. And yet when we picture the great dramas of medieval Europe, of ancient Greece, of the vast Mongol Empire stretching from China to the doorstep of Vienna, we picture kings and queens, warriors and scholars. We almost never stop to ask who carried the words between them, who were the people on the road. What did it actually feel like to be the one person trusted with the secret that could start a war? That is exactly what tonight's story is about. But before we step into that world together, if this kind of story is the reason you come back here, the kind that takes you somewhere quieter, somewhere deeper, somewhere a little more alive than wherever today left you, then take just a moment to like this video and subscribe if you have not already. It genuinely means the world, and it is truly the only way I can keep bringing these stories to you. Oh, and I am always curious, where in the world are you watching this right now? Is it late at night with the lights already off? Are you tucked in with a cup of something warm? Leave me a comment and tell me. There is something lovely about knowing that people all over the world are listening to the same story at the same moment. Now dim the lights if you can. Maybe turn on a soft fan or let the quiet of wherever you are settle around you, and let us begin. Let me take you back to the 5th century before the Common Era. Greece, a city-state called Athens. The year is 490 years before the Common Era, and the Persian Empire, the most powerful military force the ancient world had ever seen, is knocking at the door. Tens of thousands of Persian soldiers have landed at a place called Marathon, a narrow coastal plain about 25 miles northeast of Athens. The Athenians are outnumbered. They are terrified, and they have exactly one hope: if they can get word to Sparta in time, they might convince the Spartans to send their army north. So they send a runner. His name is Phidippides, and what he does next is almost impossible to believe. He runs from Athens to Sparta, not 25 miles, not 50, 150 miles, through mountains, through olive groves and dry riverbeds and roads that were little more than dirt tracks carved into stone hillsides. He runs it in under 2 days, and then, according to the ancient historian Herodotus, who wrote it down not as legend but as something people still remembered, Phidippides turned around and ran back. 300 miles total, in roughly 36 hours, on foot. Now, most people know the famous story: a Greek soldier runs from Marathon to Athens, collapses on the steps of the assembly hall, gasps the word, "We have won," and dies. It is the story that gave us the modern marathon race. It is taught in schools. It has been painted, sculpted, and dramatized for 2,000 years. But here is the part that almost nobody tells you. That story, at least in the form we know, it is almost certainly not what Herodotus actually wrote. The tale of the dramatic death run from Marathon to Athens first appears not in Herodotus, but in later writers centuries after the battle. What Herodotus actually described was something far more extraordinary. Professional long-distance runner, a man trained from boyhood in an art the ancient Greeks called hemerodromos, which translates beautifully as day runner, covering 300 miles across mountains and back in a day and a half. Not for glory, not for applause, because his city needed him to. That is the story of the messenger, and it does not belong only to Greece. Because here is something that genuinely astonishes me every time I think about it. Across every civilization, across every continent, across thousands of years of human history, before the telegraph, before the printing press, before radio, before anything, we would recognize as modern communication every single society on Earth built the same thing. A system of people who carried words from one place to another. The Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great in the 6th century before the Common Era built what historians consider the world's first organized postal network. They called it the Chapa Khani, which roughly translates to House of Messengers, a chain of relay stations stretching across the entire empire from the Aegean coast all the way to the borders of India. At each station, fresh horses waited, fresh riders waited, and a message could travel according to the Greek historian Herodotus, who was clearly very impressed. Faster than any army could march, faster than any private traveller could ride, faster than the news itself seemed possible to believe. The ancient Greeks were so struck by this Persian system that Herodotus wrote of the royal couriers in words that have echoed down through history. Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor darkness of night prevents these couriers from completing their designated stages with utmost speed. Sound familiar. Those words, or a version of them, are inscribed on the facade of the main post office in New York City. The United States Postal Service has used them as an unofficial motto for over a century. Words about Persian messengers from 2,500 years ago, carved in stone on a building in Manhattan. If that is not a reason to love history, I honestly do not know what is. But let's come back to the Middle Ages, because that is where the story of the messenger gets truly breathtakingly human. In medieval Europe, roughly from the 5th century of the Common Era through to the 15th, the world was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, city-states, church territories and trading republics. There were no telephones. There were no newspapers. There was no way for a king in London to know what a duke in Paris was planning, unless someone physically crossed the English Channel with a letter tucked inside their boot. And that meant that messengers, royal messengers, church messengers, merchant messengers, university messengers were not a convenience. They were the nervous system of civilization. They were the difference between an alliance forming or falling apart, between a war beginning or being avoided, between a queen learning her husband was dead before his enemies used that information against her, or learning it too late. The English royal records from the reign of King John, yes, the same King John of the Magna Carta, show between 30 and 60 royal messengers employed at any given time. They had official titles. The ones who rode horses were called nunci. The ones who travelled on foot were called cursores, and their salaries documented in the royal household accounts were notably higher than most ordinary workers of the time, because what they carried was not just parchment. What they carried was power. Here is the thing I want you to sit with for a moment as you lie there in the quiet. We live in a world where a message sent from London reaches Tokyo in less than a second, where a president can communicate with a general on the other side of the world in real time, where news breaks so fast that by the time most people hear about an event, half the analysis has already been written and the next story is already pushing it aside. We think of speed as something new. We think of instant communication as a modern invention. But the desire, the desperate, urgent, civilization-shaping desire to get a message from one place to another as fast as humanly possible, That is as old as humanity itself, and the people who dedicated their lives to that task, who trained their bodies, memorized secret codes, learned multiple languages, crossed mountains in winter and deserts in summer, risked capture and death. And worse, those people shaped the world we inherited. They just did it without anyone writing their names down most of the time. That is the injustice of it, honestly. An entire profession. Tens of thousands of individuals across thousands of years of history, and most of them are completely anonymous. We know the kings whose letters they carried. We do not know the people who carried them. But tonight, and across the next several hours together, we're going to change that. Because there is so much more to this story than you might expect. We're going to meet the people who did this work, where they came from, what it took to be chosen, what their mornings looked like before they set out on a journey that might take weeks. We're going to walk the roads with them, the mud, the mountains, the bandits, and the terrifying moment of crossing into enemy territory with someone else's secrets sewn into your clothing. We're going to learn about the women who carried messages that history almost entirely erased, couriers working in the shadows, less suspected, more dangerous, and arguably more effective than any official royal messenger. We're going to discover a messaging system so sophisticated, so breathtakingly fast, that it allowed one empire to control territory stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Poland. And we're going to understand why without it, that empire would have collapsed within a generation. We're going to sit with the messengers at the end of their journeys in the moment they knocked on palace gates, and waited to see whether the person inside was going to reward them or punish them for the news they brought. And we are going to reckon honestly with the fact that history has a habit of celebrating the people at the top of every story and forgetting the ones who actually made the story possible. The messenger standing in the dark outside a castle gate, letter in hand, heart pounding. The runner collapsing at the edge of a city message delivered. The rider who changed the outcome of a battle not by swinging a sword, but by arriving just barely in time with 3 words from a general 200 miles away. These are the people we owe a great deal to, and it is long past time we told their story properly, so come with me. The road is long, the night is quiet, and the first question we need to answer is this: who exactly were these people, and what did it actually take to become one of them? So we have established that messengers were quite literally the central nervous system of the medieval world. But I want to pause on something for a moment, because there is a question that almost nobody thinks to ask, and once you do ask it, you cannot stop thinking about it. Who exactly were these people? Not as a category, not as a profession, as human beings. Where did they come from? What kind of boy grows up in a medieval village, mud floors, one room, the smell of animals coming through the walls, and ends up riding with a sealed letter from a king in his saddlebag, crossing through 3 kingdoms in a week? And the answer, as it turns out, is far more complicated and far more interesting than you might expect. Let me start with something that genuinely surprised me when I first came across it. In medieval Europe, the messenger profession was not a single thing. It was an entire ecosystem. There were royal messengers employed directly by kings, often numbering between 30 and 60 at any given time in the English royal household, alone documented in records stretching back to the reign of King John at the start of the 13th century. There were noble messengers employed by dukes, earls, and powerful lords who needed their own communication networks independent of the crown. There were ecclesiastical messengers employed by bishops, abbots, and the papacy itself, carrying instructions, theological rulings, and political negotiations across Christendom. There were merchant messengers employed by trading houses like the great Italian banking families of Florence, the Hansa merchants of northern Germany, and the wool traders of the English Midlands. And then at the bottom of this hierarchy, there were what the historical records simply call common messengers, freelancers essentially working for whoever would pay them, carrying a letter from a wool merchant's wife to her sister in the next county. Every single layer of medieval society had its own parallel communication structure, and that means that in any given week on the roads of medieval England or France or the Holy Roman Empire, you might encounter a rider bearing the king's own seal, a monk carrying a papal decree, a merchant's hired hand with a bill of exchange tucked inside his coat, and an ordinary man with no formal employment at all, just someone a village had collectively agreed to trust with a letter because he was walking in the right direction. The whole system was in the most charming possible way completely chaotic. Now here is where it gets really interesting. If you were going to become a royal messenger, a proper official liveried messenger of the crown, the path to that position was not something you could simply decide to walk toward. Historians studying the records of the English royal household have identified 3 distinct routes by which someone could enter the king's messenger service, and all 3 of them tell us something profound about how medieval society worked. The first and most prestigious route was to have already proven yourself in service to a great noble household or a major religious institution. Think about what that means for a moment. You did not start at the top. You started somewhere like the household of a bishop or an earl working as a lesser messenger or even as a stable hand, and you built a reputation slowly year by year for being reliable, discreet and physically capable of doing the work. Only then, if your reputation travelled far enough, might someone at court take notice. The second route was to already be employed inside the royal household itself, in some other capacity as a servant, a clerk, a groom of the stables, and to be promoted sideways into the messenger service when a position opened. There is a real historical figure in this story that I find endlessly compelling. His name is Richard Savage, and he appears in the records of the English royal household in the year 1445. Before Richard Savage became a messenger of the Exchequer, the royal treasury, he had been a groom of the buttery. The buttery was where wine and ale were stored and dispensed. So Richard Savage started his career essentially pouring drinks. And somewhere between pouring drinks and carrying sealed documents across England on behalf of the crown, something changed. Someone noticed him. Someone decided he had the qualities required. And just like that, his entire life shifted. His wages went up. His status went up. He was given official livery, the clothing that marked him as a messenger of the king that told the world who he worked for. And he could now take on additional assignments beyond his official duties, which allowed him to earn extra income on top of his salary, from pouring wine to carrying the king's secrets. That is a medieval career arc that nobody puts in the history books but probably should. The third route into the royal messenger service was to work your way up from within the messenger system itself, starting as a courier, which is to say, a foot messenger. Someone who travelled on foot carrying lower priority correspondence and accumulating enough experience, enough trust, and ideally enough money to acquire a horse, at which point you could be promoted to nuntius, a mounted messenger, and the whole world of higher value assignments opened up before you. The horse, by the way, was not a small detail. In medieval Europe, a horse was not a convenience. It was an investment of extraordinary magnitude, roughly equivalent in terms of what an ordinary working person could afford to a small house. The ability to own and maintain a horse was itself a social marker. It meant you had capital or you had a patron who trusted you enough to provide one. So the shift from courier to nuntius was not merely a change of job title. It was a leap across an entire social threshold. Can I ask you something? If you were living in 14th century England, no last name worth anything, no land, no inheritance, no clear path forward, and someone told you that there was a profession where a commoner could rise through demonstrated loyalty and physical ability alone to a position of genuine social prestige, regular wages, and the legal protection of the crown. Would you not be at least a little tempted, because that is exactly what the messenger service offered? And I think that is one of the reasons why, when you dig into the historical records, the profession attracted such a remarkably diverse range of people. Young men from farming families who wanted to see the world beyond their village, sons of minor craftsmen with no guild membership and no inheritance to speak of, the occasional younger son of a minor noble family, not the eldest, not the heir, just a boy with some education and nowhere obvious to put it. What they all had in common was not wealth or social standing. It was something harder to define and harder to fake. So what did it actually take? What were the qualities that a king's steward or a bishop's chamberlain was looking for when they decided to trust a person with messages that could determine the outcome of treaties, wars, and marriages? The requirements were documented more or less in the practical realities of the job itself. Physical fitness was not optional, it was the baseline. A royal messenger in medieval England might be expected to cover 30 to 40 miles a day on horseback in reasonable conditions. In urgent situations, and there were many, that number could double. Some of the most demanding assignments involved riding through winter, weather crossing swollen rivers, navigating mountain passes in poor visibility, and arriving at a destination after days without adequate sleep, with the message still sealed and intact, and the messenger still functional enough to deliver it verbally if necessary. Because here is a detail that I find remarkable: not all messages were written. Literacy rates in medieval Europe were low enough that many messages, even important ones, even politically sensitive ones, were delivered orally. The messenger did not just carry a letter. Sometimes the messenger was the letter. They were expected to memorize the content of what they carried to be able to repeat it word for word in front of a king or a bishop, without notes, without prompting, without error. And if the written version was somehow lost or destroyed on the road, the messenger's voice was the backup. The messenger's memory was the archive. Languages were another non-negotiable requirement for anyone hoping to work at the higher levels of the profession. Medieval Europe was a Babel of tongues. In England alone, the language of the court and government documents was often French, or more precisely, the particular variety of French that had come over with the Norman conquest in the 11th century, and lodged itself permanently in English aristocratic culture. Latin was the universal language of the Church of legal documents of formal correspondence between kingdoms. And then there was whatever vernacular language was actually spoken on the road, regional dialects, local expressions, the particular speech of the people you would encounter at inns and at city gates, and at the courts of foreign lords. A messenger who could only speak English was, professionally speaking, severely limited. A messenger who spoke English, French, and Latin was employable across the entire known world of Western Europe. A messenger who could add Italian, German, or one of the Iberian languages on top of that was genuinely extraordinary, and could command significantly higher wages to reflect it. There is a specific passage in historical records concerning what was expected of a messenger sent on overseas assignments that I want to share with you, because it tells us something remarkable about the breadth of this profession. A messenger travelling abroad on behalf of the English crown was expected not just to deliver his message, but to bring something back. Not just a written reply, information, impressions, intelligence, the state of the roads between here and there. The mood at the foreign court was the king in good health, in bad temper, inclined toward war or peace. Were there other ambassadors present, and if so, from which kingdoms? What was the talk at the inns along the way? The messenger, in other words, was also an observer, a trained eye, a walking intelligence report. And this is the part that tends to drop jaws a little, because we think of the spy as a separate category of person, the secret agent, the man in the shadows. But in medieval Europe, the messenger and the intelligence gatherer were often the same individual. The most trusted royal messengers were expected to return with as much information as they had delivered. Every journey out was also a reconnaissance mission. Every sealed letter that arrived was also the occasion for gathering everything that was visible and audible about the world on the other side of the border. The oath. I cannot leave this topic without talking about the oath. When a messenger was formally appointed to the service of the royal household, or to the household of a great lord, or to the papal curia in Rome, they swore a formal oath of loyalty. The specific wording of the oath taken by English royal messengers has not survived intact in the historical record. The scholars who have studied these documents believe this is because the content was so well understood at the time that no one thought to write it down in full. But we know from surrounding documents and from comparable oaths taken by other royal officials what such a pledge would have entailed. Fidelity to the master, the confidentiality of messages, the duty to deliver what was entrusted to you without opening, altering, or divulging the contents, and the obligation not to serve a competing interest. That last one was thornier than it sounds. Because here is the practical reality: a royal messenger was not always employed on royal business. Between official assignments, they could and did carry messages for private individuals, for merchants, for nobles, for anyone willing to pay. This was in part how they supplemented their income, but it created an obvious tension. What happened if a private client's correspondence turned out to contain something that was, to put it delicately, not in the interest of the crown? What happened if a messenger found himself carrying, without knowing it, a letter that amounted to treason? There is a real case that illuminates exactly this dilemma. A man named Turberville, a French spy operating in England during the reign of King Edward I, was undone not by royal investigators, but by his own messenger. The messenger had been asked to carry a sealed letter. He did not know the contents, but something about the situation troubled him. Perhaps the manner of the request, perhaps some instinct refined by years on the road, and instead of delivering it to the intended recipient, he brought it directly to the king. The letter, when opened, confirmed Turberville's role as a traitor, and here is the detail that I think says everything about the moral complexity of this profession. The messenger was acknowledged by the crown for his loyalty to the king, but he had also broken his oath of fidelity to his employer. He had done the right thing by the kingdom. He had broken a sacred professional promise to do it. No one quite knew what to make of him after that. The record in the dry way of medieval bureaucratic documents simply notes that he was commended. And then, as far as we know, life went on. The livery deserves a mention because it was not merely a uniform. In a world without identity, documents, without photographs, without any of the 100 ways we now have to verify who a person is, the livery, the distinctive clothing issued to a messenger by their patron, was everything. It was proof of identity. It was a symbol of protection. A royal messenger travelling through hostile territory in the king's livery was in theory at least shielded by the authority of the crown itself. Harming or impeding a royal messenger was not merely an inconvenience to the messenger, it was an insult to the king who employed them, an act that could be interpreted as, depending on the severity of the offence, a challenge to royal authority itself. In practice, of course, this protection had limits. Plenty of messengers were robbed, beaten, and worse, regardless of whose livery they wore. But the principle mattered. The livery gave the messenger a social identity they had not been born with. It placed them, however, tenuously under the protection of power, and in medieval Europe, being under the protection of power visibly, demonstrably through the clothing on your back was not a small thing. It was the difference on a lonely road at midnight between a safe night and a dangerous one. One more thing before we move on. I want to say something about the character of the people who chose this life. Because when I read through the available historical accounts, the records of royal households, the letters preserved in archives, the occasional passage in a medieval chronicle that catches a messenger mid-journey and holds them in place long enough for us to glimpse a real human being, what strikes me is not the drama. It is the ordinariness. Most of these people were not heroic figures in the romantic sense. They were professionals. They had bills to pay and horses to feed. They had families in some city they had left weeks ago. They had opinions about which inns on the London to York road served decent food and which ones gave you something that kept you awake for the wrong reasons all night. They were in the most essential way people doing a job. A dangerous job, yes. A job that required real skill and physical courage and a kind of moral steadiness that not everyone possesses. But a job nonetheless. And yet, and this is the thing I keep coming back to, the cumulative effect of all those ordinary people doing their ordinary jobs day after day, year after year, across the length and breadth of medieval civilization, was history itself, every alliance that held, every war that was averted, every marriage that cemented a peace between kingdoms that might otherwise have gone to battle, every piece of news that arrived in time to change a decision, shift a plan, save a life. All of it depended on someone like Richard Savage, formerly a groom of the buttery, now a messenger of the exchequer, getting on a horse and riding. So now we know who they were. We know where they came from, how they were chosen, what was asked of them before they ever set foot on a road. But I have been saving the most visceral part of this story, the part that most history books skip entirely. Because knowing who a messenger was is one thing. Standing there with them at the moment they actually leave, watching them pull on their coat in the grey light before dawn, check the seal on the letter, one last time whisper something to the horse that is something else entirely. What happened in the hours before departure? What rituals existed around the act of sending? And what did it actually mean to take a piece of parchment in your hand? Know that it contained words that could change the world and walk out into the dark. That is exactly what we're going to find out. Picture a room lit by a single candle. The hour is somewhere between midnight and dawn, that particular darkness that has no name, the kind that presses against the window glass like something alive. A scribe bends over a writing desk, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. His quill moves in careful, deliberate strokes across a piece of parchment that cost more than most people in that city earn in a day. In the corner of the room, a man sits on a bench and waits. He does not read. Very possibly he cannot. He simply sits, hands resting on his knees, and he listens. Not to anything in particular. He listens the way you listen before a long journey, to the quality of the silence, to what it is telling him about the night ahead. This is the messenger, and what is about to happen in this room over the next hour before he walks out into the dark is one of the most quietly extraordinary rituals of the medieval world, a ritual that almost nobody has ever stopped to describe. Let's start with the letter itself, because the letter is not just paper. In medieval Europe, most parchment, the material on which formal letters were written, was made from the processed skin of a sheep or a calf. A single large document might represent the hide of an entire animal. The preparation involved stretching the skin on a wooden frame, scraping it thin with a curved blade, and leaving it to dry under tension until it became pale smooth and almost translucent. So before the first word was ever written, someone had already done extraordinary work. The ink typically made from a mixture of oak gall, a growth that forms on oak trees when a particular wasp lays her eggs inside, combined with iron sulfate, and a binding agent like gum arabic was corrosive enough that over centuries it would eventually eat through the very parchment it was written on. There is something poetically appropriate about that, I think. The words of medieval Europe slowly consuming the material they were written on, time devouring its own record. The scribe finishes writing. He reads it back once, perhaps twice, murmuring the words quietly to himself to check for errors. A mistake here cannot simply be deleted. The parchment must be scraped clean with the blade again, and the surface will never be quite as smooth as it was. Every correction leaves a ghost. When he is satisfied, he dusts the wet ink with fine ash from the hearth. This was one technique for drying it quickly, preventing it from smearing, and he folds the parchment into a tight, compact shape. Then comes the moment that for me is the most evocative detail in all of this: the wax. A small piece of beeswax, sometimes mixed with resin to give it a harder set, is held to the flame of the candle and dripped onto the folded edge of the letter. Not too much, not too little. Too much, and the seal cracks when it cools. Too little, and it does not hold. A small press, the seal matrix, a carved instrument bearing the unique symbol, crest or monogram of whoever is sending this letter, is pressed firmly into the warm wax. Held for a moment, lifted carefully away. And now in that cooling disk of wax there is an impression, an image, a mark that says this is mine. This was closed by my hand. This has not been read by anyone who should not have read it. The seal was in every meaningful sense the medieval world's equivalent of a digital signature, an authentication token, and a tamper-evident seal all in one. And it worked on a principle that was both elegantly simple and profoundly human. Everyone who needed to know what a king's seal looked like already knew. There was no lookup table, no system of verification. There was only the accumulated knowledge, reputation, and trust of a lifetime of public dealings. Royal and papal seals were enormous, some hanging from documents on coloured ribbons, heavy and elaborate, and so distinctive that they were recognised across the whole of Christendom. The seal of a lesser lord might be small, the size of a thumbprint, but the principle was the same. Breaking that seal opening that letter before it reached its intended recipient was not simply rude. It was a hanging offence. Let that sink in for just a moment. In the medieval world, the privacy of a sealed letter was protected not by encryption, not by technology, but by the sheer force of law, and the understanding that to violate it was to strike at the foundation of trust on which the entire political order rested. The forging of seals, pressing a counterfeit impression into someone else's wax, was treated with the same gravity as counterfeiting a coin, which, when you think about what both acts were actually doing, makes perfect sense. Now the letter is sealed. Now comes the part that fascinates me most. The messenger rises from the bench. The scribe or the lord or whoever has commissioned this journey reads the letter aloud. Not to the messenger, to the room. Because the messenger is required in many cases to memorize the contents of what he is about to carry. Pause on that for a second. The man sitting in that room may not be able to read a single word of the document he will be trusted with, and yet he must be able to reproduce the essence of its contents accurately and completely from memory alone if and when the situation demands it. This was not considered unusual or extraordinary. It was simply part of the job. Historians who have studied the communication practices of medieval Europe point out something genuinely interesting here. People who live in primarily oral cultures where writing is rare, expensive, and not universally accessible, actually tend to develop remarkable memory skills. They have to. When you cannot write something down as a crutch, you learn to hold things in your mind with a clarity and precision that most of us today have never needed to develop. A medieval messenger who'd been on the road for 10 years had almost certainly memorized hundreds of messages over that career. Some short, some long, some in Latin, some in French, some in whatever local tongue was required. His memory was a kind of living archive. And this created something that I find both poignant and deeply strange. There were secrets in that man's head that he could never tell anyone, not his wife, not his closest friend, not even a priest in confession, because the confidentiality of what he had memorized was as binding as the confidentiality of the sealed letter. He walked through life carrying knowledge he could never put down. Every message delivered was also a message never quite erased. There is one more layer to the departure ritual that the history books almost never mention: the question of what to do if things went wrong on the road. A sealed letter was in one sense magnificent protection. It proved the messenger's identity, his authorization, his purpose. No one who understood what that wax seal meant would casually interfere with him. But roads had bandits who did not care about wax seals. Borders had guards who sometimes followed orders and sometimes did not. Enemies had agents whose entire job was to intercept exactly this kind of correspondence. And so a messenger on a sensitive mission carrying something that absolutely could not be read by the wrong people had to have a contingency. Several contingencies, actually. Historical accounts describe a number of methods that messengers used to conceal documents when the situation required it. The simplest was to hide a letter inside a hollow walking staff, a carved cavity in the wood sealed at one end with a fitted plug. A more elaborate version involved sewing documents flat into the lining of a cloak or a coat, where they lay invisible between two layers of fabric completely invisible to a casual search. Some particularly sensitive messages were written on thin strips of material wound tightly around a wooden frame and concealed inside a belt or behind a buckle. There is even documentation of the practice of disguising as pilgrims the one category of traveller who could move relatively freely across medieval borders, whose humble appearance and religious purpose made them less likely to be stopped and searched. A man in pilgrim's garb, walking staff in hand, carrying nothing but a small pack and a wooden cross, was one of the least suspicious figures on any road in medieval Europe. He was also occasionally a royal messenger in disguise, with a document in the hollow of his staff that would change the fate of a kingdom. And what about those oral messages, the ones carried only in the mind without any written record at all? There was a particular vulnerability here that some senders were keenly aware of. If the message exists only in the messenger's head, then in a truly extreme situation, the only way to guarantee the message is not delivered is to guarantee that the messenger cannot speak. Medieval people were nothing if not pragmatic about such calculations, and so there arose, documented in historical sources though not widely discussed in popular history, a practice that is equal parts disturbing and fascinating. For the most sensitive oral missions, the sender sometimes relied not just on the messenger's loyalty, but on a form of what we might call enforced silence. The messenger knew things that could cause enormous damage if revealed under duress, which meant that every single hour of the journey the messenger was carrying a kind of invisible weight that had nothing to do with what was in his saddlebag. What he knew, and what would happen if someone forced him to say it, and how he would hold that line if it came to that. This is not abstract moral philosophy. For a messenger carrying sensitive intelligence across enemy territory in the 14th century, it was Tuesday. There is one final element of the departure that I want to sit with because I think it says more about the human dimension of this profession than almost anything else. When a messenger left, he was given in most documented cases a supply of money for the journey. Not a large amount. Historical wage records from the English royal household show that a messenger on assignment received a daily travel allowance that was enough to cover lodging at an inn feed for his horse and basic meals on the road. But also not nothing, because this was a world where a large portion of the population had never in their lives held enough money to pay for a week of travel. The messenger standing at the door with a coin purse and a sealed letter and a horse was for the duration of that journey someone entirely different from the person he had been before he got this job. He had purpose. He had authority, however limited and borrowed. He had resources. He was going somewhere. And I genuinely wonder when I read these records what that felt like for the young men who first stepped into this profession from the mud floors of a medieval village, to walk out of a room with a king's seal in your saddlebag, to feel the horse shift under you in the pre-dawn dark, To know that for the next 2 weeks or 3 or however long this journey takes, the road is yours. Nobody sends a messenger and then tells him precisely which path to take, which fields to cut, across which river ford to use when the main crossing is flooded. He makes those decisions himself. Out there on the road, a medieval messenger had a kind of freedom that was almost unique in the rigid, hierarchical, landlocked world of medieval society. He was between places, between masters, between the instruction he had been given and the destination he had not yet reached. And in that in-between space for a few days or a few weeks he was entirely his own. But before we follow him out onto that road, before we face what was actually waiting out there is something I need to tell you, something that is easy to say and genuinely difficult to fully absorb. The roads of medieval Europe were not roads in any sense that a modern person would comfortably recognize. What waited out there in the mud and the mountains and the long silences between one village and the next was not simply inconvenient. It was genuinely, relentlessly, sometimes fatally hostile. And the way a medieval messenger survived it, the skills, the instincts, the careful calculations he made every single hour of every single day on the road, is one of the most remarkable untold stories in the history of human travel. So settle in a little deeper if you can, because the road is about to get very real. There is a phrase that comes up again and again in the letters and journals of people who travelled through medieval Europe, and it comes up so often that after a while you start to wonder if it was just baked into the way people thought about the world back then. The phrase is simply this: God willing. God willing I shall arrive by Thursday. God willing the road to Lyon remains passable. God willing the river has not flooded the ford at Grantham again. It is easy to read that as a religious habit of speech, the pious formality of a devout age. But the more time you spend with the actual historical record of medieval travel, the more you realize it was not a formality at all. It was a genuine acknowledgement of uncertainty. The road could take your life, quietly without drama through sheer accumulation of cold and wet and dark and bad luck. And the people who travelled it regularly, messengers above all, knew this with a clarity that most of us in the modern world will never have to develop. Let us start with something concrete, because I think numbers tell this story better than anything else. A professional courier on horseback in medieval Europe, well mounted, experienced travelling a good road in reasonable weather, could expect to cover roughly 30 to 40 miles in a single day. That sounds respectable, until you put it in context. To travel from London to Rome, a journey that a papal envoy or a high-ranking royal messenger might be required to make, meant approximately 1,100 miles. At 40 miles a day in ideal conditions, that is over 3 weeks of riding. Except conditions were almost never ideal for 3 weeks straight. A single heavy rain could add 2 days to a journey by turning a navigable track into a quagmire that no horse could safely cross. There is a documented case from the winter of 1395 in France, a route between the towns of Menis and Lille, which are not particularly far apart, that became so deeply flooded with mud that it was simply completely impassable. Not slower, not harder, impassable. The medieval French legal scholar Philippe de Beaumanoir, writing in the late 13th century, complained at length about roads that had been rendered dangerously narrow by thieves who stripped away the stone paving or the wooden planks that had been laboriously laid to keep the surface usable. People would steal the road, literally dismantle the road and take pieces of it home, because the materials were valuable and nobody was watching. This is, I find, an almost perfect summary of medieval road maintenance. Chaotic, underfunded, and subject to the immediate material needs of whoever happened to be passing by with a shovel. The roads themselves deserve a moment of honest description. Much of the road network used by medieval travellers was built on the foundations of the old Roman system, and the Romans, it must be said, were extraordinary engineers. Straight lines, solid stone foundations, drainage channels, gradients carefully designed to avoid steep climbs. But here is the thing about Roman roads in medieval Europe. They were 400, 500, 600 years old, and nobody had been maintaining them at anything close to the original standard. The stone pavings had cracked, heaved, and sunk unevenly. The drainage channels had silted up or been broken and never repaired. In many places, travellers had actually started avoiding the old Roman road entirely and creating parallel dirt tracks alongside it, because the ancient pavement, buckled and pitted as it was, had become more dangerous for horses' hooves than the soft earth beside it. So the road a medieval messenger actually travelled was in most cases an unpaved dirt track that followed roughly the line of where a Roman road had once been. In summer, dusty, rutted and baked hard with wheel ruts deep enough to turn an ankle. In autumn and spring, slick with mud, sometimes ankle deep, sometimes deeper. In winter, frozen in some places and waterlogged in others, with the additional problem that the road itself might disappear under snow, leaving the traveller to navigate by landmarks and instinct, and the direction a local farmer pointed at dawn. There were no road signs. There were no maps in the sense that we would recognise. The few maps that existed, and the word map is generous, were schematic documents meant to convey rough relative positions of cities and landmarks, not navigational tools. A traveller crossing unfamiliar territory asked the way at every town, every farm, every crossroads, and the quality of directions he received depended entirely on whether the person he was asking had ever left their village, which most of them hadn't. The standard navigational tool for a long journey was something called an itinerary, essentially a handwritten list of towns between your starting point and your destination, with rough distances between them. Nothing more. No terrain information, no note about which river crossing was safe in spring, no warning about which stretch of road was controlled by a particularly aggressive local lord who charged illegal tolls. All of that knowledge lived in the heads of experienced travellers, which meant it lived in the heads of messengers. The question of navigation is one I want to stay with for a moment because it reveals something remarkable about what a professional messenger actually was. In a world without maps, without signs, without any reliable way of knowing what was ahead, except what you had either travelled before or been told by someone who had navigational knowledge was itself a form of power. A messenger who had made the London to Paris run a dozen times knew things that no document could tell you. He knew which inn on the road to Dover served food that would not make you ill by morning. He knew that the bridge at a particular ford was only reliable in dry months, and that in March you needed to ride 2 miles upriver to a shallower crossing that the locals used, and that was not marked on any itinerary. He knew which towns along the route had farriers who could reshoe a horse on a Sunday without demanding double price. He knew that the monastery outside a certain French village would give shelter to travellers carrying a letter from the right bishop, but would turn you away if you arrived with nothing to establish your credentials. This accumulated knowledge, this geography of safe places, reliable crossings, trustworthy faces, was not written down anywhere. It passed from experienced messengers to newer ones orally over long evening rides and shared meals at roadside inns. It was in every meaningful sense the oral literature of the road. Let me tell you what a typical day on the road actually looked like. The messenger rises before dawn, not because he's particularly enthusiastic about the hour, but because the calculus of medieval travel is brutal. You need every hour of daylight, and the light in northern Europe in October or November is not generous. He tends to his horse first, always, before he eats, before he does anything for himself. The horse is not a convenience. The horse is the mission. A lame horse at noon 2 days from the nearest town is a catastrophe. He eats whatever the inn or the monastery guest house provides, bread certainly, and probably something warm if the establishment is good. He drinks something, but not water, if he can help it. Water from wells and streams along a medieval road was a genuine hazard, contaminated by the same road traffic, animal waste and seepage that made the roads themselves so difficult. Travellers who could afford it drank diluted wine or ale, which was safer by virtue of the fermentation process. By the time the sun is a hand's breadth above the horizon he is riding. The pace is not a gallop. Galloping is for very short distances and genuine emergencies. A horse galloping for hours will be useless within a day. The professional messenger rides at something between a walk and a trot, a sustainable rhythm that covers ground without destroying the animal. If he has multiple horses or access to exchange horses along the route, he can push harder. Most messengers most of the time had one horse and nursed it carefully. He rides until the light begins to fail. That is the day. And I want to pause here because I think there is something about the sheer repetition of this day after day, week after week, that is genuinely hard to absorb from the comfortable distance of the 21st century. Be honest with yourself for a second. How many of us have experienced genuine physical discomfort for more than, say, a long hike, a camping trip where it rained? Now imagine that for 3 weeks, cold that does not end at nightfall because the inn is a stone room with a fire that went out by midnight, wet clothes that never fully dry because the weather does not cooperate, roads that vibrate up through the saddle into your spine for 8 hours until every joint in your body has had a conversation with the road it did not want to have, and you are alone, largely, for the majority of the journey. Because while it was safer to travel in groups, a royal messenger on urgent business could not wait for a merchant caravan to organise itself. He went when the letter was ready at whatever hour the letter was ready in whatever season it happened to be. The question of shelter is its own story. On the main travel routes, the roads connecting major cities, the pilgrimage routes that ran like arteries across medieval Europe, there was a reasonably functioning network of places to stay. Inns in the larger towns which varied wildly in quality. The better ones had stables and clean enough rooms and food that was at least recognisable. The worse ones were essentially drinking establishments with a straw-covered floor where travellers could sleep in a communal pile, paying for the privilege of being slightly warmer than outside. Monasteries were often the most reliable option, and for a messenger travelling on official business with credentials to prove it, the monastery guest house was a significant advantage. The Benedictine rule of hospitality, the obligation to receive and shelter travellers as if receiving Christ himself meant that a weary rider who arrived at a monastery gate before Compline prayers was almost always given a better meal and stabling for his horse. No charge, or a modest voluntary offering. This was not charity in a modern sense. It was a sacred duty embedded in the founding rules of monastic life. And for a medieval messenger who knew the monastery network along his route, it was an infrastructure of rest and safety that he relied on absolutely. The oldest surviving coaching inns in England, some of which date back to the 14th and 15th centuries, were originally established by monks for exactly this purpose. The hospitality of the road was for much of medieval history essentially a church service. But now I need to tell you about something that the inn and the monastery and the friendly guest house could not protect you from. Something that a messenger on a long road carried as a constant background awareness, the way you might carry awareness of weather when you're hiking alone. The awareness that not everyone you might encounter was glad to see you. Because the roads of medieval Europe were not merely difficult, they were dangerous. Not in an abstract or theoretical sense, in the very specific, very practical sense that there were people on those roads whose livelihood depended on taking things from other people. Bandits. The historical record is full of them, not as romantic figures, not as the swashbuckling outlaws of later legend, but as a grinding, persistent reality of road travel. Many of them were former soldiers. The medieval world had an unfortunate abundance of men trained in organised violence, who found themselves between wars without employment. A group of such men on a lonely road, identifying a traveller who appeared to be carrying something valuable. A messenger in good livery clearly employed by someone important was a real and recurring threat. The Spanish traveller and writer who described crossing the Alps in the early 16th century left us an account that could have been written 3 centuries earlier. Hidden within the magnificence of the mountains was what he called a gauntlet of hardships, bone-chilling winds, cruel snowstorms, washed-out trails, and the ever-present danger of bandits in those lawless reaches. Some of those bandits were not even independent actors. They were operating sometimes with the tacit approval of local lords who charged illegal tolls and used the threat of violence to enforce payment from travellers passing through their territory. The messenger had to know or quickly learn which roads were controlled by whom, which lords were likely to be hostile to whoever he was carrying letters for, and how to navigate through or around territory that was actively dangerous. And this knowledge, again, was not written anywhere. It was survival intelligence gathered and shared among the community of professional travellers, updated constantly as political alliances shifted and new dangers appeared. Here is a detail from the historical record that I find oddly moving. There is a letter preserved from the Paston family of Norfolk, a collection of correspondence from 15th century England that historians consider among the most valuable windows into everyday life of the period in which a servant writes to apologize for a delayed reply. The reason for the delay, he explains, was simple. He could not find a messenger willing to travel to London before Christmas, not a messenger who was unavailable, not a messenger who was sick or injured or occupied with another commission, a messenger who was willing to make that particular journey at that particular time. The road conditions and the seasonal dangers were severe enough that an experienced professional had looked at the situation and declined. The letters were sitting ready sealed, waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough, or perhaps simply experienced enough to know which route was safe enough to take. They waited for weeks. That servant's letter, if messengers to London could have been found before Christmas, the letters were ready to go, is to me one of the most eloquent small testimonies to the reality of medieval road travel I have ever come across. Not a dramatic moment, not a battle or a catastrophe, just a quiet acknowledgement that the road itself could simply say no. And yet 17,000 letters passed between Florence and Genoa in the late 14th century, documented, tracked. The postal historian Peter Spufford calculated from the dates of sending and receiving that most of those letters made the journey through the Alps across northern Italy, along roads that could turn to rivers overnight in 5 to 7 days. Every single one of those letters was carried by a person on a horse, mostly alone, who had decided that day that the road was passable and the mission was worth it. The human capacity to simply get on with it, to make difficult things routine through sheer practice and professional stubbornness, is not, I think, something that changes much across the centuries. The messengers who crossed those mountains in all weather, who knew which monastery would take them in and which road the bandits had abandoned for the season, who arrived dusty and saddle-sore, and handed over the letter and turned around for home, those people were not heroes in the dramatic sense. They were professionals. And the distinction matters to me because I think we have a tendency to reserve our admiration for the spectacular moment and ignore the extraordinary ordinariness of people who simply showed up every day and did the hard thing. There is one more dimension to life on the road that I have not yet touched on, and it connects to everything we have talked about in a way that I find genuinely surprising. We have discussed the dangers of the physical road, the mud, the cold, the bandits, the unreliable bridges. But there was another kind of danger, one that did not come from weather or from strangers. It came from the very nature of the messenger's job itself, because a man travelling alone across hostile territory carrying something that powerful people desperately wanted to intercept, that man was always one bad decision away from a situation where speed and discretion were the only thing standing between him and something far worse than a delayed delivery. How a medieval messenger actually survived that, the specific skills, the calculated instincts, the quiet art of staying invisible on a road where everyone could see you, is one of the most fascinating chapters in this whole story. And it begins with understanding that the greatest weapon a messenger ever carried was not a dagger, not a letter of safe conduct, not even the king's own seal. It was the ability to look like exactly who no one were looking for. The cliffhanger we left ourselves with deserves an honest answer, because the phrase I used, the ability to look like exactly who no one was looking for, sounds romantic. It sounds like something from a spy novel. A dashing figure in a cloak slipping past torchlight invisible by craft and cunning. The reality, as usual, was considerably less cinematic and considerably more interesting. Surviving on a dangerous road in a world at war with itself and everyone around it was not mostly about drama. It was mostly about judgment, about reading situations before they became dangerous, about making 20 small correct decisions in a day so you never had to make a dramatic one. And the messengers who lived longest, who accumulated decades of service rather than a brief promising career, followed by an unmarked grave somewhere in a field, were not for the most part unusually brave. They were unusually smart. The first thing a professional messenger learned somewhere early in his career was what I would call the geography of danger. Not the dangerous places on a map, those shifted with every season of warfare and every change in the political wind, but the logic of danger, the patterns. Bridges were dangerous, not because bridges were inherently hostile, but because a bridge is a choke point, a place where everyone on this section of road must pass through the same narrow space at the same time. Anyone wanting to intercept someone on that road would wait at the bridge. Any local lord wanting to extract an illegal toll would position himself at the bridge. Any group of former soldiers turned freelance extortionists would control the bridge. A messenger who knew his route knew not just where the bridges were, but which ones were watched, which ones had alternative fords a mile upstream, which ones were garrisoned by men who were sympathetic to the crown, and which by men whose loyalties were charitably complicated. Market towns were similarly double-edged. They were useful. You could buy food exchange information, find a farrier for the horse. But a stranger riding into a market town in time of war was also a stranger being seen by several hundred people, any one of whom might be in the pay of someone who wanted to know who was travelling this road and why. The experienced messenger moved through market towns with a particular combination of confidence and invisibility that professionals in dangerous trades develop over time. Visible enough not to seem suspicious, forgettable enough to be forgotten. Disguise, genuine, deliberate planned disguise was a real and documented tool. The most common and effective cover was the pilgrim. Think about what the medieval pilgrim represented in the cultural imagination of the time. A person who had set aside normal life to undertake a journey of spiritual significance. Someone who had by definition left home and was travelling far from it. Someone who carried very little of value. The point was penitence, not comfort. And crucially, someone whose movement across borders and through foreign territory was not only accepted but protected by a combination of religious custom, practical tradition, and genuine popular sympathy. You did not rob a pilgrim. Not because it was physically dangerous, but because it was the kind of act that people talked about for years afterward and not admiringly. A messenger on a sensitive mission dressed in the simple clothing of a pilgrim wool, undyed, travel-worn, carrying a walking staff with a hollow cavity cut into its interior, and a scallop shell badge pinned to his hat, was one of the most effectively camouflaged figures on a medieval road. He was also almost certainly not the only fake pilgrim on that road. The irony of the medieval pilgrim network, that great circulating system of genuine devotion and mixed motive, is that its very effectiveness as cover had made it something of an open secret. Everyone knew that pilgrimage routes were also used for other purposes. Intelligence officers, merchants smuggling goods past customs lovers, travelling to meet each other, political dissidents, making discreet exits from inconvenient situations. The Pilgrim Road was genuinely democratic in exactly this way. It served everyone's needs simultaneously and asked very few questions. Invisible ink deserves its own moment here because it is one of those details from medieval history that sounds so improbable that people assume it must be a later invention. It is not. During the 100 Years' War, that grinding catastrophic century of conflict between England and France that defined the politics of Western Europe from the early 14th century well into the 15th, English and French intelligence operatives on both sides were using letters written in materials that were invisible until heat was applied. Vinegar was one option, milk was another. Both of these substances, when used as ink on parchment and allowed to dry, are effectively invisible to the naked eye. When held near a flame or simply left in strong sunlight for a period, the organic compounds in the liquid darken as they oxidize and the writing becomes legible. The technique was old, much older than the medieval period. Ancient Greek and Roman writers describe it. But the 100 Years' War seems to have been one of the first conflicts in European history where it was used systematically by organized networks of couriers who were specifically trained in both the production and detection of concealed writing. A letter that looked to any intercepting soldier or hostile border guard like an entirely innocent piece of correspondence, a merchant's invoice, a family letter, a routine administrative document might contain invisible, between the visible lines, a complete intelligence report about troop movements, supply routes, or the disposition of a besieged garrison. The innocent-looking letter was in this sense carrying two separate conversations at once, one for whoever might intercept it, one for whoever was meant to receive it, and letters were intercepted, regularly, consequentially. Let me give you a specific case, a real one documented in the historical record with the precision of someone who understood exactly how much it mattered. The year is 1467. England is in the middle of the Wars of the Roses that sustained brutal conflict between the House of York and the House of Lancaster over the English throne, a war that would drag on in various phases for decades and leave a scar across the memory of an entire generation. A messenger travelling through Wales in the service of Margaret of Anjou, the Lancastrian queen by this point, effectively operating as a political exile, working to restore her exiled husband to the English throne, was captured. We do not know his name. We do not know how he was caught, whether by intelligence, bad luck, or the simple misfortune of being on the wrong road at the wrong moment. What we know is that the letter he was carrying was read, and what it contained was something its author had almost certainly never intended to become public. The letter revealed that Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, one of the most powerful men in England, at that moment nominally a supporter of the Yorkist King Edward IV, was in secret correspondence with the Lancastrian cause. The intercepted letter, carried by an anonymous courier who probably knew nothing of its true significance, exposed one of the most consequential acts of political treachery in 15th century England. Warwick, who would subsequently earn the historical epithet the Kingmaker for his role in raising and then destroying two separate kings, was revealed as a double dealer years before history would record his formal switch of sides. One captured messenger, one broken seal, history tilted, the safe conduct letter, the official document granting a messenger or envoy guaranteed safe passage through territory that might otherwise be hostile, is one of the more fascinating artifacts of this whole world. In theory, it was enormously powerful, A safe conduct issued under the seal of a recognized authority was supposed to guarantee that the bearer would be allowed to pass through, carry out their mission, and return without being detained, robbed, or harmed. Attacking a messenger carrying a valid safe conduct was not merely illegal. It was, depending on the political context, potentially an act of war. A declaration that you did not consider yourself bound by the agreements and conventions that held the political world together. In practice, safe conducts were respected roughly as often as the political situation required them to be, which is to say, when both parties had something to gain from respecting them, they worked beautifully. When one side had more to gain from ignoring the agreement than honouring it, the piece of parchment in the messenger's saddlebag was suddenly not quite as protective as advertised. The Bishop of Regensburg, a German clergyman caught in the middle of a conflict between the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope in the 14th century, solved the problem of an inconvenient papal messenger, arriving with a declaration that his city was to be placed under an interdict by the simple expedient of having the envoy thrown into the river. Then he claimed, with what must have been either extraordinary nerve or extraordinary self-delusion, that he had never received any such message. The messenger had presumably not drowned, but the bishop's point had been made. Now let me tell you about a particular kind of danger that does not appear in most histories of this period, not because it was rare, but because it was quiet. I want to talk about what happened on the road when a messenger began to be followed, not captured, not confronted, just followed. The medieval intelligence services, and they existed even if they were less formalized than modern equivalents, understood very well that a messenger trying to lose a tail had to make choices that would reveal as much as catching him outright. If he suddenly changed his route, doubled back, took an unexpected road that in itself was information, it meant he knew he was being watched. It meant someone had told him to expect surveillance. It meant the network he was operating within was in some sense already aware of the threat. So the experienced messenger, when he suspected he was being followed, faced a genuinely difficult calculation. He could not behave normally because whatever he was carrying was too important to risk. But he could not behave abnormally because that would confirm he was not who he appeared to be. The solution documented in various accounts and intelligence histories from the period was to do something so audaciously ordinary that it diffused the situation entirely. Stop at the next inn, order food, engage the innkeeper in conversation about local matters, sleep apparently soundly in the common room with a dozen other travellers, and then in the deep hours of the night slip out through the back of the building, find the horse, and ride hard in a completely different direction from the one he had appeared to be travelling. The calculation behind this manoeuvre is elegant, and I find it quietly impressive every time I think about it. The follower, watching a man behave with complete normality all evening, faces his own decision at some point: is this actually the person I was sent to intercept, or am I wasting my time on an innocent traveller? If he commits to surveillance through a full night at an inn, he's investing significant time and effort in someone who may be nobody. And in that moment of doubt, that brief human hesitation, the messenger was already gone. I want to linger on one more example before we move forward, because it is perhaps the most dramatic single instance of disguise and concealment in this entire story. The year is 1429, and France is at a crossroads. The city of Orléans has been under English siege for more than 6 months. The Dauphin Charles, who has not yet been crowned king, and whose entire claim to the throne is being contested by the English, is holding court at Chinon, hundreds of miles south, and somewhere between Vaucouleurs and Chinon, riding at night through Burgundian territory held by the English, is a 17-year-old girl from the village of Domremy. Her name is Jeanne, and history would later call her Joan of Arc. She's not technically a messenger, but her journey is one of the most remarkable acts of information delivery in medieval European history, because what she was carrying was not a sealed letter, but something more fragile and more powerful, the credibility of a prophecy, the possibility of hope, and the specific private knowledge that she claimed would convince the Dauphin of her divine mission. She travelled dressed in men's clothing, on horseback, at night specifically because the territory she was crossing was patrolled by forces that would have detained or, worse, a young woman travelling alone toward the Dauphin's court. She covered roughly 300 miles in 11 days, and when she arrived at Chinon, the Dauphin reportedly disguised himself as a courtier in the crowd to test her to see if she could identify him without knowing his face. She did. Whatever else one thinks about this story, the mechanics of it are a masterclass in the intersection of information and theatre that defined medieval political life. The message she carried was herself. The disguise was necessary. The arrival changed everything. Something I keep turning over in my mind reading all of this, the people who did this work, who lived inside these calculations day after day, were operating without any of the tools we associate with intelligence tradecraft today. No electronic surveillance, no photographs of known operatives, no secure communications infrastructure, no way to verify in real time whether the information you were carrying was still valid or had been overtaken by events while you were on the road. They had judgment. They had experience. They had in many cases a deep and specific knowledge of human nature, because a person who has spent years watching how other people behave on roads, at borders, in inns, at gates, develops a particular kind of literacy. The ability to read a room, the ability to sense when something in a situation is slightly wrong, the ability to look at a man who says he is going to lion and know from something indefinable in the way he holds himself or hesitates before answering a question that he is probably going somewhere else entirely. That skill does not have a name, but it kept people alive, and in the world we've been building together across these last several hours that matters enormously, because now we're going to meet the people who brought that skill to its most extraordinary expression. The people who did this work not just in spite of being overlooked, but because of it. The couriers whose most powerful asset was not speed or strength, or even knowledge of the road. It was the simple, devastating fact that nobody expected them to be carrying anything important at all. Everything we've talked about so far, the mud roads, the bandits, the careful pace of 30 miles a day, the weary messenger nursing a single horse through winter weather, arriving at a monastery gate just before dark, all of that describes a world operating at human speed. What I want to show you now is what happened when one civilization decided that human speed simply wasn't fast enough. What I want to show you is what an empire looks like when it builds its communication network the way an engineer builds a machine with ruthless precision, absolute standardization, and absolutely no patience for delay. Brace yourself, because the numbers are going to seem impossible. They are not. The year is somewhere around 1235 of the Common Era. The Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world, stretching from the Korean peninsula in the east to the doorstep of Poland and Hungary in the west, from the frozen steppes of Siberia in the north to the edges of Persia and northern India in the south, is in the process of solving a problem that no empire before it had quite managed to solve at this scale. How do you govern 12 million square miles from a single centre? How does a Khan sitting in Karakoram in the heart of Mongolia know what is happening on the banks of the Danube 3,000 miles away, in time to actually do something about it? The answer that Genghis Khan began building, and that his son Ugadai Khan formalized and expanded from approximately 1235 onward, was something called the yam. The word comes from the Mongolian term for a relay station, an urtur, which translates more or less as a checkpoint, and the yam was, in the most straightforward description, a chain of relay stations spaced approximately 20 to 30 miles apart, stretching across the entire territory of the empire. That is not a metaphor. That is not an approximation. At the height of the system under Kublai Khan in the second half of the 13th century, Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who travelled through the empire and left us some of the most detailed first-hand accounts of what he saw, counted more than 10,000 yam stations in operation across Asia alone. 10,000 stations, 300,000 horses kept in readiness across the network. Now let me describe what actually happened at one of these stations, because the mechanics of the system are what make it so extraordinary. The station itself was not a tent or a crude shelter. Marco Polo described the yam stations as large and handsome buildings, rooms furnished with fine beds decorated with silk, stocked with food and drink, maintained at a standard that he found comparable to a comfortable inn anywhere in the known world. At each station a fixed number of horses, sometimes 200 to 300 at a major station on an important route, were maintained in a constant state of readiness. Well-fed, rested, already saddled or ready to be saddled within minutes. When a courier arrived, there was no ceremony, no delay. He rode in hard, dismounted, handed his documents to the station staff, or directly to the next rider who'd been alerted to his arrival, and that next rider was already mounting. The original courier could rest, or eat, or sleep if he needed to. The message was no longer waiting on his body. It was already on the next horse, already halfway to the next station, already in motion. The speed this produced is the part that still stops me every single time I read it. A Mongol courier on an urgent mission could cover 200 to 300 miles in a single day, not over several days, in one day. For perspective, a typical medieval English messenger on a good horse in good weather covered 30 to 40 miles a day. A really exceptional rider pushing hard with multiple horses might reach 100 miles on an extraordinary day. The Mongol yam at its operational peak moved information at 2 to 3 times even that exceptional rate. A message from Karakorum in Mongolia could reach the western edge of the empire, a journey that would take an ordinary traveller the better part of a year in something like 2 weeks. 2 weeks to cross a third of the world, with the tools available in the 13th century. There is a calculation that Marco Polo makes in his account of the system. He notes that a courier travelling by the yam could cover in one day what would otherwise take 10 days to travel. A message that would ordinarily require 100 days to reach its destination arrived in 10. And for absolutely urgent dispatches, messages that could not wait even for the standard relay process, there was an additional layer. Footrunners stationed at smaller posts every 3 miles along secondary routes who carried messages in a kind of sprint relay, each runner covering 3 miles at full speed before handing off to the next. Marco Polo reports that these runners wore wide belts decorated with bells so that the sound of their approach gave the next runner at the next post enough advance warning to be ready to be already in motion, so that not a single second was lost in the transfer. Read that detail again for just a moment. Someone is running as fast as they possibly can through the countryside of 13th century Asia, bells jangling from their belt, so that the person waiting for them 3 miles ahead can hear them coming before they can see them. The Mongol Empire had in effect designed a physical internet. Packets of information moving across a network of nodes passed from hand to hand without waiting for any individual carrier to rest, eating up distance at a speed that was essentially impossible by any other method the world had yet devised. The Paisa deserves its own moment. If the YAM network was the hardware of the Mongol communication system, the Paisa was the access credential. A Paisa was a flat tablet made of gold, silver, or iron, depending on the rank of the courier that bore the seal of the Khan, and a declaration of the bearer's right to use the YAM system and to demand assistance from anyone along the route. A gold Paisa, the highest level, was essentially a command from the Khan himself. A man holding a gold Paisa could walk into any YAM station, requisition horses, food shelter, and an armed escort if needed, and no one along the route had any legitimate authority to refuse him. Marco Polo's party travelled through the empire under a version of this, a tablet of gold as he described it, inscribed with the instruction that they should be supplied with everything needful in all the countries through which they should pass, horses, escorts, provisions, whatever they required. The modern equivalent is perhaps a government diplomatic passport combined with an unlimited corporate expense account and the personal backing of the most powerful man in the world. That was the Paisa, and the yam riders who carried it understood something that the messengers we have been following through the mud roads of medieval England could never quite count on, that the entire machinery of the most powerful empire on earth was for the duration of their mission working specifically to make them fast. But I want to resist the temptation to simply celebrate the scale of all this without asking the harder question. Who paid for 10,000 stations? Who maintained 300,000 horses? Who kept the buildings furnished, the grain stores full, the riders fed and ready at 3 a.m. when an urgent dispatch arrived? The answer is uncomfortable, and it is one that the history of the yam tends to gloss over in favour of the impressive numbers. The yam system was funded by an obligation, a tax essentially levied on every city, village and hamlet that sat near a yam route. Marco Polo recorded this directly. Every settlement near the postal stations was required to supply a fixed number of horses, a fixed quantity of provisions, a fixed number of men. The obligation was mandatory. Non-compliance was not a bureaucratic inconvenience. It was a problem for which the Mongol administrative system had, let us say, efficient solutions. Local populations were conscripted into maintaining a system from which they themselves received very little direct benefit. The villages that provided the horses did not get to use the yam for their own purposes. The farmers who supplied the grain did not receive news from the capital in 2 weeks. The people who built and maintained those handsome buildings with silk-furnished rooms were not sleeping in them. The yam was in a very real sense built on forced contribution, the labour and resources of millions of ordinary people extracted upward to serve the communication needs of an empire that had in many cases conquered them relatively recently. This does not diminish the engineering achievement. The yam was genuinely extraordinary, but understanding how it was sustained changes what we make of it, and reminds us, as it always should, that great systems have human costs that the official accounts tend not to dwell on. The system could not last forever. Empires rarely do, and the Mongol Empire was no exception. By the middle of the 14th century, the great unified empire had fractured into competing khanates, the Yuan dynasty in China, the Golden Horde in Russia and Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia. Each fragment maintained its own version of the yam, but without the central authority that had originally created it, the network began to degrade. Corruption crept in. Stations went unmaintained. The obligation to supply horses became negotiable where it had once been absolute. Riders who had previously moved with the absolute authority of the Khan now found themselves in a world where that authority was disputed, fragmented, sometimes entirely irrelevant to the local lord whose territory they were crossing. By the time the Yuan dynasty fell to the Ming in 1368, the transcontinental network was gone, but what it had built did not entirely disappear. In Russia, the successor state that emerged from the Golden Horde preserved a version of the yam system the Russians called the coachman, who operated the relay service a yamshchik, a word that is a direct linguistic descendant of the Mongolian yam, and it formed the foundation of the Russian imperial postal network that would persist for centuries. An entire chapter of Russian communication history is named etymologically after a Mongolian relay station. Language carrying the memory of a system that was itself designed to carry messages. Here is the thing I find myself returning to whenever I think about the yam, and I want to share it with you because I think it says something genuinely important. The Pony Express, the famous American relay mail service that captured the imagination of a country, and became one of the enduring symbols of frontier courage, operated for approximately 19 months between April of 1860 and October of 1861. It covered roughly 2,000 miles between Missouri and California. At its fastest, a rider could cover about 75 miles in a day. It is remembered as one of the great achievements of human communication. The Mongol Yam covered 12 million square miles. It operated for over a century. It moved messages at 2 to 3 times the speed of the Pony Express, using nothing but horses, organizational genius, and a level of administrative discipline that the 19th century American West would have found difficult to imagine. And yet most people in the world today have heard of the Pony Express and could not name the Yam if asked. That asymmetry between the fame of one and the relative obscurity of the other is itself a kind of lesson about whose stories get told and whose get quietly filed away in the margins of history. What I find most human about this whole story, though, and I do mean this, is not the scale of the Yam. It is not the engineering, not the 300,000 horses, not the 10,000 stations. It is a single detail that Marco Polo recorded in passing, almost as an afterthought. He described watching one of these riders arrive at a station in full flight horse, at a gallop, dust billowing behind them, the bells on the approaching runner already audible half a mile away. He described the efficiency of the changeover, the swift dismount, the documents transferred, the fresh horse already waiting. The new rider already up and gone before the dust from the first one had quite settled. And then he noted something about the riders themselves that has stayed with me ever since. They bound themselves to the saddle, leather straps around the chest, around the abdomen, tightened before each leg of the journey began. Not because they were afraid of falling, because they were riding so fast for so long that without the straps, the exhaustion of the ride itself, the sheer physical battering of the hours at full gallop, would eventually cause them to slip. Not a dramatic fall, not an injury, simply the slow incremental surrender of an exhausted body to the rhythm of a horse that was not going to slow down. The straps were not there to hold them on. They were there to make sure the body kept showing up even when it had already decided it was done. I don't know. Something about that detail. The leather bands tighten the jaw, set the next station somewhere out there in the dark, feels to me like the truest and most honest image of what it meant to be a messenger. Not the speed, not the empire. Just a person bound to their purpose, refusing to stop. But even this, even the breathtaking machine that was the Yam, was not the whole story of how messages moved across the medieval world. Because while the Mongol Empire was building its courier network out of speed and scale and imperial authority, something quieter and in some ways far more subversive was happening in the shadows of the medieval courts and cities of Europe. A whole category of messenger that the official records barely acknowledge. People who carried information not because a king commanded it or an empire required it, but because the stakes were personal enough and the cause urgent enough, and the suspicion of anyone who might be watching low enough that their very invisibility was the point. There is a particular frustration that comes with studying medieval history, and it is this: the people who kept the records were almost always the people who already had power. Kings and their chancelleries, church officials with their meticulous Latin documents, guild masters noting down transactions in leather-bound account books. The machinery of medieval record-keeping was operated by and largely served the interests of men in positions of institutional authority, which means that every time a woman appears in those records actually named, actually credited with an action, actually described as doing something that mattered, you have to stop and ask yourself a question. If this woman was visible enough to be recorded, how many more were invisible? If these few names survived, how many hundreds did not? That question is what I want to hold on to as we step into what is, for me, one of the most electrifying chapters of this whole story. Let us start in a specific place, a specific moment. The city of Ypres in what is now Belgium. The summer of 1489. Ypres is a city under pressure, part of a coalition of Flemish cities, locked in a grinding conflict with the Habsburg Archduke Maximilian of Austria, who's been trying for the better part of a decade to assert control over Flanders after the death of his wife Mary of Burgundy left the region's political future contested and unstable. The cities of Gambrouge and Ypres have been resisting him. The stakes are not abstract. These are cities with ancient guild rights, with local political traditions, with real economic skin in the game of who governs them. And in this conflict, communication between the three rebel cities is not a convenience. It is survival. A message that takes too long to arrive might mean a garrison is abandoned without support. A piece of intelligence that does not reach its destination might mean a supply route is cut before anyone can protect it. The official mail messengers are known. They are watched. They are stopped at checkpoints, searched, questioned. The enemy forces operating in the countryside around Ypres are specifically looking for official communication networks to intercept. So the city of Ypres does something that the official history would later choose not to remember very clearly. They send women. The evidence for this survives not in a chronicle, not in a dramatic narrative of any kind, but in something far more durable and far more boring: financial records. The city accounts of Ypres for 1488 and 1489 hundreds of pages of careful, meticulous record-keeping that sat in the state archives of Belgium for centuries, largely unexamined, contain dozens of entries: payments to women, for delivering letters, for gathering intelligence, for travelling through enemy-occupied territory on behalf of the city. Two historians, Lisa de Metz of Ghent University and Jelle Hemers of KU Leuven, analysed these records in recent years, and what they found there has quietly rewritten a portion of medieval history. In total, the Ypres accounts for just those 2 years record the names of 38 women, and note that as well that these were only the ones named, with many others listed simply as a woman or the wife of, engaged in intelligence activities for the city. 38 named women in 2 years in one city, and the activities they were paid for were not passive or marginal. They were delivering sealed letters through enemy checkpoints. They were travelling on foot, unarmed, often alone, through territory controlled by Maximilian's German mercenaries. They were gathering intelligence. The city records use a specific phrase to describe what several of these women were sent to do. The Flemish expression translates directly and precisely as to find out about the enemies, not to deliver a letter and come home, to go out, look, listen, assess, and come back with information. One woman appears in these records more than anyone else. Her name is Josine Hellebout, and I want to tell you about Josine Hellebout because she deserves to be known. Before the revolt, as far as we can tell from the available records, Josine Hellebout was nobody particular. A woman from Ypres, unremarkable. The kind of person whose ordinary life left no trace in official documentation, because ordinary lives in medieval Europe were not considered worth recording. That ordinariness, as it turned out, was her greatest professional asset. From May of 1489 onward, Josine Hellebout appears in the Ypres city accounts again and again and again. 11 separate missions, 11 entries. In each one she was sent out through hostile territory toward Dixmude, toward Poperinge, toward towns and military positions that were in or near areas held by Maximilian's forces. Her stated task in the language of the accounts to gather information about the enemy, to ascertain the positions of the Austrian troops, to track movements, to report back. She was paid 12 shillings per mission on average, a little more if she visited multiple locations or stayed on site for intelligence gathering purposes. 12 shillings for 11 missions, for walking into enemy territory alone on foot and coming back with information that the city's military commanders needed. The historians who analyse these records note something that I find both practical and quietly devastating. The reason women could do this work so effectively was precisely because nobody expected them to be doing it. Women were not in the medieval military imagination soldiers. They were not operatives. They were not the kind of people who carried letters between rebel cities or gathered intelligence about troop deployments. They were invisible in the way that assumptions make people invisible. And in that invisibility lay an extraordinary professional advantage. A woman walking along a road in 1489 Flanders was not automatically a suspicious figure in the way a man of military age would have been. She was not stopped with the same frequency. She was not searched with the same thoroughness. She passed through checkpoints that would have detained, or worse, a male messenger, because the guards operating those checkpoints had a mental model of what a threat looked like, and she did not fit it. But let me be clear about something, because I think it is important not to romanticize this into something it was not. These women were not invisible because they were unimportant. They were invisible because the world they lived in had decided they were unimportant, and they turned that decision against itself with considerable skill and considerable courage. Josine Hellebaut, walking 5 hours north toward Dixmude through countryside, crawling with German mercenaries, was not safe. She was unarmed. She had no official status that would protect her if she was recognized. She had no safe conduct from the Habsburg side, no institutional backing, no protection beyond the unremarkable appearance of an ordinary woman on an ordinary road. If she was caught, if someone searched her, carefully found the letters, asked the wrong questions, there was nothing diplomatic about her situation. She was a civilian in wartime, carrying information for the enemy. The records note that she undertook journeys of more than 100 kilometers into hostile territory, on foot, in the summer of 1489, and she came back. 11 times she came back. Josine Hellebaut was not alone, and this is crucial. The Ypres accounts mention another woman, Marguerite Lony, who was dispatched both by day and by night. The city accounts use those exact words to carry urgent letters to a military commander stationed more than 50 kilometers away. Given the distance and the urgency, historians believe she likely travelled continuously through the night on foot, without rest, through territory that was actively contested. The accounts record that she was paid for this. They do not record whether she was frightened. They do not record what she thought about the night she walked 50 kilometers through a war. But she did it. Crispine Sroys and Beatrice Sissons, two women who appear in the records together, carried out a mission that required them to pass through a town occupied by enemy soldiers. They were on their way to a location on the other side with letters. They walked through the enemy garrison, went past the soldiers, delivered the letters, came back. They were paid for this. And then the following week or the following month they presumably went on with their ordinary lives, because what else was there to do? What I cannot stop thinking about when I read these records is the question of what happened after. The Flemish revolt ended when Maximilian eventually won. When the conflict was over and Habsburg authority was reasserted, the first thing a conquered city did, as Lisa Demetz pointedly notes in her research, was destroy its sensitive records, the documents that might have identified the women who had worked against the occupation. The detailed records of missions, payments routes, contacts, burned, gone. The deliberate erasure of evidence that, if found, might endanger the people who had helped, which means that the 38 names we have from Ypres are the names of women whose city did not fall completely, whose records were not entirely destroyed. They are the survivors of a much larger archive. And if even those records nearly vanished, if this entire network came within a bureaucratic decision of disappearing entirely, then we have to reckon seriously with how much of this history is simply gone. How many other cities in how many other conflicts employed similar networks and left no trace? Historians Demetz and Hamers, reflecting on their findings, put it directly: Their hope is that this discovery will encourage other researchers to look for women like Josine Hellebaut in the records of other conflicts, other countries, other centuries. Because the implication of what they found in Ypres is not that Flemish women were uniquely exceptional, the implication is that we have been looking at the wrong records. The Islamic world had recognized this dynamic much earlier and more systematically. By the late 7th century of the Common Era, intelligence networks operating across the Umayyad Caliphate and its successor states had become sophisticated enough that rulers and administrators were actively aware of a fundamental problem. Male agents operating in a society where men and women move through different social spaces simply could not access certain kinds of information. The household, the women's quarters, the conversations that happened in spaces where men were not present. And so women were recruited sometimes from the highest levels of society, sometimes from the lowest, to gather and carry information that was simply unavailable to any male operative. The medieval Islamic scholar and historian Masudi, writing in the 10th century, described networks of female information gatherers that had been operating since the earliest period of Islamic governance. He noted with the dry matter-of-factness of a careful writer that women could pass through spaces that men could not enter, could hear conversations that men could not be present for, and could travel in certain capacities with less suspicion than their male counterparts. This was not a secret discovery. It was institutional knowledge applied systematically. Closer to Western Europe, there is a small but striking entry in the English royal records from around 1209. A woman named Alice of Saint-French by origin, travelling in England, appears in the accounts as someone paid for services rendered to King John. Her documented role, as far as historians can determine from the surrounding records, exploratrix. The Latin word for someone who investigates, explores, gathers information. A spy in plain language. Alice of Saint is one of the only women to appear in early 13th century English royal records in this capacity. She was paid. She was named. She was at least within the logic of King John's administration a professional. We know almost nothing else about her, but she was there. Can I ask you something just between us? When you picture a medieval messenger, when your mind builds the image that goes with everything we've talked about tonight, what do you see? I would guess. For most of us, it is a man on a horse. And look, for the majority of official documented paid messenger work in medieval Europe, that image is historically accurate. The records confirm it. But the records, as we have just seen, are incomplete. The records are the testimony of power written by power, preserved by power. And power in medieval Europe had a very specific idea of whose activities were worth writing down. The 38 women of Ypres were written down almost by accident because the city of Ypres kept meticulous financial accounts, and those accounts happened to survive. 1 city, 2 years, 38 names. Project that outward across every conflict, every city, every decade of the medieval period, and the picture that emerges is not one of occasional exceptional women doing unusual things. It is the outline of a shadow history, a parallel system of information running alongside the official one, populated by people who were never supposed to be there, but who were there nonetheless, doing the work, getting paid sometimes in some places when the records were kept carefully enough to capture it, and then going home or going on to the next mission, and leaving almost nothing behind. There is a phrase in the Ypres records that the researchers highlight, and I want to share it, because it does something that the dry language of financial accounts rarely does. When the entries for the most active women shift, when the city begins recording not just expenses reimbursed, but actual wages, actual salary for work performed, the Flemish phrase used in the accounts is salaris en arbeid, salary and labour, not a favour, not a charitable payment, not a gratuity, a salary for work. Josine Hellebaut, the woman from Ypres, who nobody had ever heard of and who walked through enemy territory 11 times in the summer of 1489, was a professional. She had a salary, she had a job. She was by any reasonable definition a messenger, a courier, an intelligence operative. And the fact that most history books have not treated her as such is not a reflection of what she was. It is a reflection of who was writing the history books. We've travelled a long way tonight in every sense of the word. We have walked roads that tried to kill people. We have ridden with the fastest couriers the medieval world ever produced. We have sat in candlelit rooms watching seals be pressed into warm wax. And now we have stood with Josine Hellebeur on a road outside Ypres in the summer of 1489, watching her set out toward a town held by the enemy carrying letters no one was supposed to know about toward a destination she'd already travelled to 9 times before. There are more chapters to this story, and the next one begins where almost all the most interesting chapters in history begin at a door, a palace gate, a moment of arrival, the instant when the long road finally ends and the messenger, whoever they are, whatever they have survived to get here, raises their hand to knock and waits to find out whether the person on the other side is glad they came. The gatehouse of a medieval castle is not where the story ends. It is where an entirely different kind of pressure begins. Think about what has happened to get to this point. Days of riding or weeks. Roads that were trying to kill you in weather that was not helping. A sealed letter kept safe through all of it, or a message held intact in memory through everything the road threw at you. And now finally the destination is visible, the towers, the walls, the gate. The end of the road is right there. But a castle gatehouse in the 14th or 15th century was not a door you simply walked through. It was a system, a layered, deliberate, sometimes infuriating system of verification protocol and controlled access, designed to ensure that the person coming through these gates was exactly who they claimed to be, and that whatever they were bringing in was something the inhabitants actually wanted inside. For a messenger arriving at a royal palace or a major noble household, the experience of getting from the outer gate to the person they needed to see was, depending on the circumstances, anywhere from a moderately tense administrative process to one of the most nerve-wracking experiences of their professional lives. The outer gate came first. A porter, or in a larger establishment, a gatehouse staff of several people, whose job was specifically to control who entered and who did not. The porter was in the medieval household hierarchy, a position of genuine power. Not glamorous power, not the power of a lord or a knight, but the practical daily power of the person who decided whether you were allowed in. A messenger arriving at the gate would identify himself, who he was, who had sent him, and what he was carrying. Not in vague terms, in specific terms that could be verified. He would present his livery, the identifying clothing that marked him as a messenger of a specific household or institution. He would present his credentials, the official document, if he had one, authorizing his mission. He might present his sealed letter to allow the porter to confirm that the sender's seal matched what was expected. In some establishments, a messenger arriving with urgent news was escorted immediately inward by a member of the household staff not left to wander. Always accompanied, always watched. In others, and this was more common for less urgent correspondence, the messenger might be asked to wait, sometimes briefly, sometimes for several hours, in the great hall or in the gatehouse anteroom, or simply in the courtyard, depending on the weather and the customs of the household. That waiting was its own particular kind of experience. Here is something I find almost poignant about the structure of medieval court protocol. Direct access to the king, or to any truly powerful lord, was extraordinarily rare and carefully controlled. The closer you got to the top of the medieval power structure, the more layers of intermediary stood between you and the person at the centre. A messenger, even a royal messenger carrying something urgent, did not simply walk into the king's presence, hand over a letter and say, from your cousin the Duke of such and such. What actually happened was more complicated and in its way more interesting. The letter or the oral message passed through hands before it reached the king. A chamberlain or a high-ranking household officer would receive the messenger in a more public space. He would examine the credentials, inspect the seal, assess the messenger's account of the journey and the circumstances of the dispatch. If the message was routine, it might be summarized for the king by that intermediary, without the messenger ever entering the inner chambers at all. If the message was genuinely urgent, or if the sender had specified that it was to be delivered personally, the messenger might be brought forward, but usually still not directly into the king's presence without preparation. The king's chamberlain would alert the king that a messenger had arrived. The king would indicate when and where he would receive the message. The whole process could take an hour. It could take a day. In exceptional circumstances, it could take longer. And throughout all of that waiting, the messenger's job was to be available to be patient and to not make any of the people who had the power to either expedite or delay his access any more irritated than they already were. Patience in the messenger profession was not a virtue. It was a professional survival skill. Now we arrive at the moment I have been building toward since we stepped into this whole story. The actual delivery. The moment when the sealed letter changes hands, when whatever has been written in that candlelit room, however many weeks ago, however many miles away, finally arrives at the person it was intended for. And here the story gets frankly terrifying. Because a messenger was not a delivery service. A messenger was a representative, a proxy, a diplomatic presence. If the letter contained good news, a peace offer accepted, an alliance confirmed, a marriage agreed, the messenger might be rewarded handsomely. Gifts, money, a meal at minimum. The historical records of the English royal household contain numerous entries for payments made to messengers who brought welcome news. Sometimes the reward was generous enough to be genuinely life-changing for a person of modest means. But if the letter contained bad news, if it contained a refusal, an insult, a declaration of hostility, a demand that felt like an affront, the person standing holding the letter was the nearest available target for the emotional reaction of the person who had just read it. And medieval people, especially powerful medieval people, were not particularly known for emotional restraint in the face of bad news. The phrase, "don't kill the messenger," has been with us so long that it has become a cliché, a piece of folk wisdom used so casually in offices and boardrooms that its original meaning has lost most of its weight. But the idea was not a metaphor when it was first articulated. It was a practical warning about a documented phenomenon. The Greek writer Sophocles expressed it in his tragedy Antigone. No one loves the messenger who brings bad news, in the 5th century before the Common Era. The historian Plutarch, writing around the 1st century of the Common Era, records one of the most striking specific examples. Tigranes the Great, the Armenian king, who had built a formidable empire across Western Asia, received a messenger bringing the news that the Roman general Lucullus was advancing toward his territory. Tigranes, who could not bring himself to believe that any foreign general would dare challenge him, had the messenger's head cut off. Plutarch notes the consequence with the dry precision of a man who found it slightly ridiculous no one after that dared bring Tigranes any further news. So he sat unknowing while the war that would eventually reduce his empire to a Roman client state was already blazing around him. He had eliminated the information because he could not tolerate the information, and then he lost. The sentiment survived well into the medieval period. Shakespeare wrote it into at least 2 plays in Henry IV. The Earl of Northumberland received a messenger bringing news of his son's death in battle, and assures him with notable self-awareness that the tongue offends not that reports his death. In Antony and Cleopatra, Cleopatra receives a messenger who has brought news that Mark Antony has married another woman. She initially threatens, in language that is not particularly subtle to treat his eyes as decorative objects. The messenger points out with considerable courage that he did not make the match, and therefore should not be held responsible for it. These were not just theatrical flourishes. They were reflections of a real dynamic that anyone who worked as a messenger in the medieval period navigated constantly. Some lords and some rulers were genuinely capable of understanding that the messenger was not the message. Others were not, and the messenger standing in the great hall or the private chamber watching the face of the person who was reading or hearing his dispatch was doing a very rapid calculation about how the next few minutes were likely to unfold. There is a real case from medieval England that illustrates exactly what could go wrong. During the reign of King Henry V, the conqueror of Agincourt, celebrated as one of England's greatest warrior kings, a messenger arrived at court with dispatches from France. The news was not good. A military situation had deteriorated. A position that was supposed to be held had not been held. Men had been lost. The king's reaction was recorded by a contemporary chronicler as severe enough to terrify the attendants present. The messenger himself was not physically harmed. The English royal household by the 15th century had developed enough institutional sophistication to understand that harming official messengers created worse problems than it solved, but the account makes clear that the messenger's experience in that room, the duration of it, the tone of it, the things that were said in his presence about his information, and the people responsible for it, was not something any professional would have chosen to repeat. The message had survived the road. The messenger had to survive the arrival. There is something that I think is genuinely underappreciated about the kind of emotional intelligence this profession required. A messenger who arrived with bad news had to be simultaneously several things that do not naturally coexist. He had to be honest. The point of a messenger was to deliver the actual message, not an edited version of it designed to minimize the recipient's distress. Softening bad news or burying it in qualifications was professionally a form of failure. He had to be composed, showing fear, the very real fear that the person in front of you with their authority and their temper and their political frustration might decide you personally were a convenient outlet for their reaction, was also a form of failure. Composure in the face of a powerful person's anger was a skill that took years to develop, and he had to be diplomatic. After the letter was delivered, the messenger's job often included answering questions. What was the situation like when you left? What were the conditions? What did the person who sent this seem to think about the situation? The messenger was in that moment an intelligence source as much as a delivery vehicle. All of this standing in a candlelit hall in clothes that had not been properly cleaned in 2 weeks. After a journey that had probably involved at least one river crossing, he would rather forget. But here is the counterpoint, and it matters just as much. Not all deliveries were bad news. Not all arrivals ended in a tense reckoning. The historical records of medieval royal households contain warm entries too, payments to messengers described as joyful bearers of good tidings, rewards given not out of obligation but out of genuine relief and gratitude. A king whose distant ally has agreed to a marriage alliance has just received something that may secure his dynasty for a generation, and the person who brought him that news is at least momentarily very welcome in the room. Some of the most detailed records of generous payments to messengers come from exactly these moments: births of heirs, confirmations of alliances, arrivals of ships carrying ransom prisoners home. The messenger who had spent 12 days riding from a distant court with good news could in those circumstances find himself the recipient of a purse of coins that represented months of normal wages. There was a randomness to it, a dependence on external fortune that must have been one of the stranger features of the profession. Your reward for the same journey, the same work, the same skill was entirely determined by what was written on the parchment you were carrying, and you did not get to choose what was written on it. One last detail before we move on, because it sits with me and I think it should sit with you too. There is a term in medieval diplomatic practice called in Latin the ius gentium, the law of peoples, the principles that were supposed to govern the conduct of states and rulers toward each other, even in war, even in conflict. Among those principles, one of the most consistent across cultures and across centuries was this: envoys and messengers in their official capacity were supposed to be inviolable, not just protected, inviolable, untouchable. The understanding embedded in Greek practice, Roman law, medieval Christian and Islamic traditions alike was that the machinery of communication between powers had to be insulated from the politics it was conveying. If you could harm the messenger, you could silence every future message, and that served no one. Tigranes, who proved this point by demonstration, lost his empire. The bishops and lords who periodically forgot the principle and harassed or detained official messengers found themselves in most documented cases facing significant diplomatic and sometimes legal consequences. The rule existed because experience had taught repeatedly that breaking it was its own punishment, and yet it was broken regularly by people who in the moment cared more about the message than the principle, which tells us something true about the medieval world, and something equally true about people. The messenger who survived the delivery, who walked back out of the great hall with his message, received his mission complete, his body intact, still had a job to do. Because the arrival was not the end. It was the halfway point. What came after the delivery was something that almost no history of this subject discusses: the languages of secrecy, the codes and hidden meanings woven into correspondence that the messenger might carry or might himself be expected to understand, that transformed the simple act of delivering a letter into something closer to carrying a conversation between two people who could not be in the same room. The art of hidden meaning, the craft of the cipher, and what it tells us about what the people who inhabited this world truly thought when they were certain no one unauthorized was listening. Here is a riddle from the medieval world, and I want you to hold it in your mind before I give you the answer. A letter sits on a desk. It has been written by a senior church official. It is addressed to a bishop in another country. In its visible text, it discusses theology. It praises God. It asks after the health of its recipient's parishioners. It is on its surface a perfectly ordinary piece of ecclesiastical correspondence. It is also simultaneously a detailed intelligence report on troop movements. How? The answer to that riddle is the subject of the next hour, and it is one of the parts of this story that still makes me feel, whenever I think about it carefully, a particular kind of awe. Not for the cleverness of it, though. The cleverness is real, for what it reveals about the people who created these systems, people who understood perhaps better than we give them credit for that the world was always listening. Let's start with a simple question. In a world where a sealed letter could be intercepted, forced open and read by an enemy, what do you do? The naive answer is seal it better. Use stronger wax. Find more trustworthy messengers. Rely on speed. All of those things were done and all of them were useful. But they addressed the problem of access, not the problem of comprehension. The deeper answer, the answer that the most sophisticated political and military operators of the medieval world arrived at independently across different cultures and different centuries, was to make the letter incomprehensible to anyone who was not supposed to read it, even if they did manage to open it. Not by hiding it, by transforming it. The oldest methods were not about transforming letters into other letters. They were about hiding the message entirely in a technique that scholars of communication history call steganography, from the Greek meaning covered writing. The ancient world had found ways to do this that were by modern standards almost comically impractical. The Greek historian Herodotus describes, apparently with a straight face, a method used during the Persian Wars in which a message was tattooed onto the shaved head of a trusted slave. The slave's hair was then allowed to grow back. The slave was then sent on a journey, and upon arrival the recipient shaved the slave's head again to read the message. Setting aside the obvious logistical questions, chief among them being what do you do for the 6 weeks it takes the hair to grow, the method did have one genuine advantage. A slave at a checkpoint looks like a slave at a checkpoint, not like a letter. Medieval equivalents were somewhat faster. Invisible inks made from lemon juice milk or diluted urine were applied to parchment and allowed to dry. The resulting text was completely invisible to the naked eye under normal conditions. When the parchment was held near a heat source, a candle, a fire, the organic compounds oxidized and the text became visible as it browned. The technique required no special equipment to use or to decode. It required only that both parties knew to look for it. A letter that appeared to discuss nothing but the price of wool in Bruges might, when heated, reveal its actual contents between the visible lines. But invisible ink, however ingenious, had a fatal weakness. If someone knew to look for it, if they suspected the letter might contain concealed writing, they could find it simply by applying heat to the whole thing. The next level of the problem required a more sophisticated solution. This is where ciphers enter the picture. A cipher in the simplest terms is a system for replacing the actual letters of a message with other symbols, letters, or characters according to a pre-agreed key. The earliest systematic cipher in the European record is usually attributed to Julius Caesar, not because he invented the concept, but because we have clear historical documentation of his specific method. He shifted each letter of the alphabet a fixed number of positions A, became DB, became E, and so on. Simple, functional, and for his contemporaries reasonably effective. By the medieval period, cipher systems had developed considerably beyond simple letter substitution. In 1379, and this is a date I find remarkable, a man named Gabriele de Lavinde of Parma compiled what is considered the first European manual on cryptography. He was working for the Vatican. The manual, which still survives in the Vatican archives, contains cipher keys for 24 separate correspondents of the papal curia. 24 different cipher systems, each unique to a specific diplomatic relationship, managed simultaneously by the papal bureaucracy. The Vatican was, in other words, running what we would today recognize as a key management infrastructure in 1379. But cipher systems of the sort Gabriele de Lavinde was documenting were not widely used, not because people did not understand their value, but because they required something that was genuinely scarce in the medieval world. Two people who had already met agreed on the cipher and exchanged the key. You could not establish a cipher system by correspondence, because the whole point of a cipher system was that your correspondence was not secure. You had to have met in person, or sent a trusted intermediary, or used some other prior channel to agree on the method before you needed it. This meant that cipher use was largely confined to established diplomatic relationships to the papal curia and its network of ambassadors and bishops to royal chanceries that maintained ongoing correspondence with foreign courts to the major Italian banking houses that had offices across Europe and could use their own personnel to establish shared keys. For most messengers, most of the time, cipher was not part of their toolkit. What they had instead was something older, more flexible, and in some ways more interesting. It was called in the terminology of medieval diplomatic practice a verbal credential, and it operated on a principle that I find genuinely elegant. When a messenger was dispatched on a sensitive mission, the sender would sometimes not write the actual content of the message at all. Instead, they would compose a letter that said in polished diplomatic language something along the lines of the bearer of this letter, whom I trust entirely, will communicate to you by word of mouth the full substance of what I wish to convey. The letter was a letter of introduction and authentication. The message was in the messenger's head. And the beauty of this system, the part that rewards thinking about, is that no interceptor, however skilled, could extract the message from the letter by reading it. Because the message was not there, it was in a person, and that person could be coached to deliver it only to the right recipient, only under the right conditions, only after the recipient had demonstrated knowledge of an agreed-upon verification phrase or asked the right confirming question. The messenger in this model was not carrying a message. The messenger was the message, a living, breathing, walking encryption of information that could only be decoded by the person it was addressed to. The German abbot Johannes Trithemius, a genuinely fascinating figure who died in 1516, wrote the first printed book on cryptography. He called it Steganographia, and he wrote it in Latin, which was appropriate given that he was a Benedictine monk with an abbot's sense of the appropriate audience. The book appeared on its surface to be a manual for summoning angels. It was not in any conventional sense a manual for summoning angels. It was a sophisticated treatise on methods for hiding messages inside innocent-looking text, dressed in the language of angel summoning to deflect the suspicion of anyone who was not already in on the joke. The technique he described in its practical application was something we would now call a null cipher, a system in which the actual message was hidden within a longer innocent-looking text according to a pre-agreed rule. You might take the first letter of every third word, or the second letter of every fifth word, or every seventh word itself. What appeared to be a devotional prayer or an astrological calculation to anyone reading it without the key was in fact a complete and accurate intelligence report to anyone who knew how to extract it. Trithemius was forced late in his life to resign his abbacy, partly because other people suspected his writings were less about angels than he claimed, and more about things he was not supposed to be doing. They were right, incidentally. Here is an example that I think is almost impossibly clever, and I want to describe it carefully because it deserves its own moment. During the Wars of the Roses, the same 15th century English conflict we encountered earlier, in connection with the interception of a letter that exposed the Earl of Warwick's treachery, Margaret of Oxford, wife of the imprisoned Lancastrian Earl of Oxford, sent her husband a letter. She knew or strongly suspected that the letter would be intercepted. She could not write plainly. What she wrote, by the analysis of historians who have studied the surviving document, was a letter carefully constructed so that its true meaning was systematically different from its visible meaning, not through any technical cipher, but through the deliberate use of courtly language, agreed personal references, and pre-established signals that only her husband, who knew her and knew their private code, could properly interpret. The apparent text discussed innocuous family matters. The actual message concerned political strategy and the people who were working to secure his release. The letter was intercepted. The interceptors read it. They found nothing of operational significance. Her husband received it eventually, as the historical record confirms, and understood exactly what she'd written. Now let me tell you something that I think gives all of this a dimension that the technical history of cryptography often misses. The messenger who carried that letter from Margaret of Oxford to wherever her husband was being held was carrying in a very real sense a private language between two people, a language built from shared history, from years of knowing each other, from the accumulated intimacy of a marriage between two people who had navigated the brutal politics of 15th century England together long enough to develop a kind of communication that was by its nature unbreakable by anyone outside it. No cipher wheel could have encoded that letter. No systematic substitution algorithm could have generated it. It was encrypted by a life lived together, and it could only be decoded by the person who had lived that life alongside her. And the messenger who carried it, who almost certainly could not read it, and would not have understood it even if he could, was transporting something far more intimate than intelligence. He was transporting the unbroken connection between two people that the political machinery of their world had tried very hard to sever. I find something deeply moving about that. There is a broader point lurking inside all of this, and I want to name it directly. When we think about secret communication in the medieval world, we tend to think of it as a technical problem with technical solutions. Ciphers, invisible inks, steganographic techniques, the ingenuity of method. But the most effective form of concealment in medieval communication was not technical at all. It was human. It was the pre-existing relationship, the shared context. The fact that two people who had known each other long enough had developed almost without realizing it, a private language that encoded everything they needed to say to each other, in terms that looked to anyone outside the relationship like perfectly ordinary correspondence. A king writing to a trusted ally might use a particular phrase, something apparently innocuous, something that had passed between them before, that both parties understood to mean something specific, not because they had sat down and agreed on a cipher, but because they had been in enough situations together that certain phrases had acquired particular weight. This kind of communication, the informal human relationship-based encryption of meaning, is the hardest form of coded correspondence to detect, the hardest to break, and the most resilient. It does not require key exchange. It does not require a cipher manual. It requires only trust and shared history. And in a world where both were genuinely scarce and genuinely precious, that made it the most powerful form of secret communication that existed, can I ask you something? Think about the people in your own life with whom you have a language like this, the shorthand. The reference points the single word that means something completely specific, because of something that happened years ago that nobody else was there for. Most of us have at least one person like that. Now imagine carrying messages between two people like that across 300 miles of difficult road without understanding any of it. The messenger carried not just the words, he carried the relationship. That was in a very real sense what he was doing every time he rode. What we have been building toward across all of these hours together is a portrait of a world that ran on trust, and on the people willing to carry that trust through physical space, through danger, through the politics of arrival and reception, and sometimes punishment. And now we arrive at a chapter that addresses what happened when the system failed. Not when a messenger was robbed or a letter was intercepted or an arrival ended badly, but when the message itself, the information it contained, arrived too late, or not at all. When the entire chain, the sealing the road, the delivery the reading came apart at a single point. And the consequences rippled outward in ways that changed history. At some point in this long journey together, I think it is worth stopping for something that historians of the medieval period tend to treat as a secondary concern, but which I find genuinely fascinating. Not the drama of the road, not the politics of the arrival, but the much quieter question of what these people actually got paid, and what exactly that payment meant in the context of the world they lived in. Because money in the medieval world was not simply a number, it was a social statement. What you earned told the people around you who you were, where you fit in the order of things, how seriously you deserved to be taken. And the wages of a professional messenger, when you actually look at what the historical records say, are considerably more interesting than you might expect. Let me give you some numbers, because the numbers are the story. In England, in the middle of the 14th century, the going daily rate for an ordinary labourer, a man doing unskilled physical work, digging ditches, carrying loads, the work that most men with no particular skill or training did to stay alive, was roughly 3 pence per day. A skilled craftsman, a mason, a carpenter, a thatcher might earn 4.5 pence per day. Perhaps 5 pence if they were particularly experienced or working in a place where their skills were scarce. An annual wage of £1 360 represented a relatively comfortable income for a household servant in a modest establishment. Now, under the Ordinance of 1347, a specific surviving document from the reign of Edward III, which set out the official wages and conditions for royal messengers, an English king's messenger was paid 6 pence per day in time of war. In time of peace, the available records suggest a daily rate of around 4.5 pence, still at the upper end of what skilled craftsmen earned. But the daily wage was not the whole picture. On top of the daily payment, royal messengers received a livery allowance money specifically to cover the cost of official clothing, the garments that identified them as the king's men. The 1347 Ordinance records this at 1 mark per year, 13 shillings and 8 pence specifically for livery in peacetime. The more senior messengers, those at the higher tier of the service, received 2 full sets of clothing per year, or the cash equivalent, and when a messenger was sent on a specific assignment dispatched to another part of the country or overseas, he received travel expenses on top of his regular wages calculated per day and per mile. Compare these numbers to what the world around the messenger was earning, and the picture that emerges is clear. A royal messenger was not wealthy by any standard that would matter to a lord or a merchant of substance, but he was consistently materially better off than the majority of the working people around him, better off than the man digging the road, better off than the thatchers and farm labourers who worked from dawn to dark for 3 pence a day, roughly comparable to the skilled craftsmen who built the cathedrals, the masons and carpenters whose labour was respected enough to command premium wages, and then periodically dramatically better off than any of them when a successful mission returned a reward gift from the king or the recipient of good news. The historical records of the royal household contain entries for payments to messengers that run considerably higher than their standard wages rewards for particularly swift delivery for messages that arrived at a critical moment for journeys undertaken under exceptionally dangerous conditions. A messenger who had ridden through a siege or crossed a frozen sea in December, or survived an attack that would have stopped a less determined person, sometimes received a gift that represented months of ordinary income. The money was not guaranteed. The risk was always present that a particular journey would end badly and the reward would not arrive at all. But the potential was real, and in a world where most people's economic ceiling was essentially fixed by the circumstances of their birth, the messenger profession offered something relatively rare, the possibility that a particularly good year could look very different from a merely adequate one. Here is where the social status question gets genuinely complicated, and this is the part I want to sit with for a moment. Medieval society was organised in its official ideology around 3 estates: those who pray the clergy, those who fight the nobility and knights, those who work everyone else. That third category was theoretically undifferentiated. A wealthy merchant with ships in 3 ports and a house in London was in the framework of official medieval social theory in the same category as a serf who owned nothing and could not leave the land without his lord's permission. In practice, of course, this was obvious nonsense and everyone knew it. Medieval society was deeply stratified even within the broad category of workers, with merchants, guild masters, skilled craftsmen, clerks, and a dozen other intermediate groups occupying gradations of status and respect that the 3 estates model could not adequately describe. Into this complicated middle space fell the messenger. He was not a noble. He held no land, no title, no hereditary position. He was not a craftsman bound to a guild practicing a trade passed from father to son within a recognized social structure. He was not a clergyman with the church's institutional backing. He existed in a category that was genuinely hard to place because his social identity was more than almost any other medieval worker borrowed rather than intrinsic. When he was on the king's business wearing the king's livery, carrying the king's seal, he had the backing of the most powerful institutional authority in the kingdom. When he was between assignments, sitting in an inn, travelling without official commission, he was a man of moderate means with no particular social standing to speak of. The same person in different contexts occupying two entirely different positions in the medieval social hierarchy. Can I ask you something genuinely curious? Try to imagine what that felt like, not as an abstract social observation, but as a lived experience. You grow up in a medieval village. Your father farms someone else's land or works as a minor tradesman in a market town. Your social position is for most practical purposes fixed. It is not a tragedy necessarily. Millions of people lived entire lives within those boundaries and were not personally tormented by them. But it is fixed. And then through the kind of path we've already described, the combination of luck and ability, and the notice of someone with power, you end up as a messenger of the royal household. For the duration of your official missions, you carry the king's authority. You ride into the courtyard of a great lord's castle, and men who would ordinarily pay no more attention to you than to the weather turn and take note because the livery you're wearing tells them that you come with the power of the crown behind you. You sit at the table of a bishop while waiting to deliver your letter, and you're offered food and drink and asked about the news from court, because what you know and what you might be willing to share is genuinely valuable to the people around you. And then the assignment ends. You go home, and you are again a man of moderate wages in a borrowed set of good clothes. The whiplash of that, the constant movement between borrowed authority and ordinary reality, must have been, I think, one of the stranger psychological features of the profession. What the records show is that most professional messengers responded to this ambiguity in one of two ways. Some invested the instability itself with meaning, embracing the in-between nature of their work, finding identity in the mobility that most people around them did not have, in the knowledge they accumulated in the particular pride of a profession that demanded qualities most people could not supply. There is something in the historical record that points toward this. The royal messenger service in its more formalized periods had characteristics of a professional community. The same names appear repeatedly across multiple years of royal accounts. The same individuals undertook dozens of missions over careers spanning a decade or more. There was evidently a culture within the service, shared knowledge, shared professional standards, the kind of accumulated expertise that develops when a group of people do difficult work together over time. Messengers who had served for many years were in documentary evidence given preferential consideration for assignments. Their experience was valued and rewarded with access to better missions, higher status destinations, the more sensitive commissions that required additional trust. That is the shape of a profession that had enough internal culture to have something like a career ladder, and people who build careers tend to find meaning in them. The other response to the social ambiguity was to try to use the position to achieve something more stable. The historical record contains examples of messengers who parlayed their years of service into genuine upward mobility. The contacts accumulated over a career in the royal messenger service were not trivial. A man who had spent 15 years carrying letters between the court and the great noble households of England, had been in the private chambers of earls, had witnessed the private business of bishops, had been trusted with the correspondence of the most powerful people in the kingdom. That kind of access, that kind of demonstrated trustworthiness was socially valuable in ways that went beyond the official job description. Some messengers moved sideways into administrative positions, roles as clerks or household officers, in the households of the noblemen they had served precisely because those noblemen trusted them on the basis of years of professional reliability. Some moved into more profitable private work managing correspondence networks for merchant houses that recognize the value of someone with deep expertise in travel in roads, in the practical art of getting things from one place to another. A very few appear in the records as recipients of small grants of land, the most meaningful form of upward mobility in the medieval world, awarded as rewards for long service. Not knights, not lords, not men whose names would appear in the chronicles, but men who had started with nothing more than their own reliability and their own legs, and who had arrived at the end of a long careers at something more substantial than where they had begun. The clothing deserves its own moment, because in medieval society what you wore was not a vanity. It was a communication. It told everyone who saw you, who you were, who you served, what your position was in the elaborate social performance of medieval public life. The livery of a royal messenger, the distinctive colours and styling of the official clothing provided by the royal household, was not just practical identification. It was a visual declaration of allegiance and authority. When I trace through the specific wardrobe accounts from the reign of Edward III, the level of detail is striking. Categories of cloth-specified colours, the quality of the materials, whether the garments included fur trim, the frequency of replacement. These were not rough working clothes. They were carefully specified garments designed to make the messenger legible, to tell the world at a glance who he worked for. And there is something in that visible legibility that I find genuinely poignant about this profession. In a world where most people's social identity was largely invisible to strangers, where a merchant looked like a craftsman, looked like a minor official to anyone who did not already know them, the messenger wore his identity on his body. His credentials were his coat. His authority was his livery. His professional self was inseparable from what he put on each morning. Which means that when the livery was off, when the official clothing was set aside, when the mission was over, when the man was just himself travelling without commission, there was a person underneath all of that who history has almost nothing to say about. We know what he did. We know what he was paid. We know the roads he travelled, the letters he carried, the courts he entered. We do not in most cases know who he was when the coat was off. Whether he was lonely, whether the life suited him or wore on him, whether he thought much about what he carried or kept it firmly at professional distance, the way people in trusted positions learn to do. But I think the most honest thing the historical record tells us about the social status of medieval messengers is this: they were indispensable in a way that was never quite acknowledged. The entire political structure of medieval Europe, the alliances, the diplomacy, the management of kingdoms at distance, the networks of commerce and communication that held civilization together depended completely on their work. But they appeared in the financial accounts, not the chronicles. They were the infrastructure. An infrastructure in every age has the peculiar quality of being noticed only when it fails. When a letter arrived on time, when a message got through, when the alliance held, because the communication had not broken, nobody wrote it down. When a message failed to arrive, when a treaty fell apart because a messenger was delayed, when a battle was lost, because an order did not reach its destination, that was when the records mentioned the messenger, in failure. Which means that the historical record is in a sense a list of the times the system broke. The 1,000 times it worked are in the silence between the entries. We have talked about payment and prestige. We have traced the strange double life of someone who was powerful in one context and ordinary in another. But there is one chapter of this story that speaks most directly to what happened, when all of it, the skill, the dedication, the professional reliability, the miles and the months and the careful maintenance of the chain of communication collapsed at a single critical moment, because the messenger did not always get through. And when they did not, when the letter arrived too late, or not at all, when the chain broke at the worst possible moment, the consequences were not measured in professional disappointment. They were measured in lives, in kingdoms, in the course of history itself. History has a particular kind of silence around its turning points. Not the silence of nothing happening, the silence of the moment just before everything changes. And in that silence, almost every time you look closely enough, there is a message that did not arrive, or arrived too late, or arrived at the wrong hands. I want to spend this part of our journey together in that silence, in those specific, verifiable, historically documented moments when the chain of communication broke and the world tilted as a result. Not as a meditation on tragedy, as an honest accounting of what the profession of the messenger actually meant, because we have talked at length about the messengers who succeeded, about the letters that arrived, the alliances that held, the wars that were averted because someone rode through the night and got there in time. But success leaves no drama and little record. The disasters are where the story becomes visible. Let me take you to the summer of 1214. The stakes are by any measure extraordinary. King John of England, the same King John whose royal household employed 30 to 60 messengers, and whose reign gave us the Magna Carta, is in the middle of the most ambitious military operation of his career. He has assembled one of the most powerful coalitions in medieval European history. On one side, King John's English forces pushing into France from the west, advancing through the Loire Valley. On the other side, coming from the north and east, the Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV, with the Counts of Flanders and Boulogne, and the combined forces of most of northwestern Europe's great lords. The plan is simultaneous pressure from two directions. Philip Augustus of France, caught between two advancing armies, would be forced to divide his forces, and the combined weight of the coalition would overwhelm the French. It is on paper a well-designed plan. It requires, as all such plans do, that the timing works. It requires that John knows what Otto is doing, and Otto knows what John is doing, and both coordinate their movements in relation to each other and to Philip's responses. It requires, in other words, reliable communication between two armies operating hundreds of miles apart in a world where the fastest message moved at the speed of a horse. On the 2nd of July 1214, John is defeated at La Roche-aux-Moines, a setback that was in itself not necessarily fatal. He retreats, he regroups. But the news of his retreat must reach Otto, and Otto must understand that the coordinated pressure from the west has collapsed, and Philip Augustus, who now has his western flank secure, turns north with his full army to face Otto alone. On the 27th of July 1214, at a place called Bouvines, a muddy field near Tournai in Flanders, the battle happens. Philip wins. Otto flees the field on horseback. The Counts of Flanders and Boulogne are captured. The entire coalition, the most powerful anti-French alliance of the early 13th century, is destroyed in an afternoon. What follows matters enormously. John defeated his grand strategy. Collapsed returns to England, facing a baronial revolt he can no longer suppress from a position of strength. Within 18 months he is signing the Magna Carta on a meadow by the Thames, not because he wants to, but because the military credibility he needed to resist his barons has been destroyed at Bouvines. One battle, one afternoon in a Flemish field. But behind it, the failure of a coalition that depended on coordination, that depended on communication, and communication that depended, as it always did, on the people carrying the messages between them. Whether the specific messages between John and Otto failed, or whether the timeline simply did not allow for adequate coordination, historians debate the details. But the structural reality is undeniable. A coalition fighting a coordinated war across hundreds of miles in the 13th century was only as coherent as its messengers were fast. And at Bouvines, whatever the specifics, it was not fast enough. Now let me tell you a story that the chronicler Jean Froissart tells, and which I want to describe with some care because it is one of the most visceral images in this entire history. The year is 1345. The 100 Years' War is in its early grinding phase. In the southwestern French region of Gascony territory, technically under English control, A castle called Oberroche is under siege. A French army of roughly 7,000 men has encircled it. Inside the castle, a small garrison of Anglo-Gascon soldiers is holding on, but they cannot hold on indefinitely. The commander Alexander de Caumont needs to get a message to the English forces under Henry Earl of Derby who are somewhere in the region. So he does what you do when you are besieged. He sends a messenger. The messenger slips out of the castle by night. He has the letters sewn inside his clothing as documents describe a detail I find wonderful. The cloth itself as a kind of last resort concealment, the body as the envelope. He gets far enough that it matters, and then he is caught. The French soldiers who catch him read the letter. They understand what it is. They understand that the garrison inside the castle is trying to call for help, and they do something that is either a piece of extraordinary psychological warfare or an act of pure frustrated contempt depending on how you read it. They load the messenger into a trebuchet, a massive siege engine, designed for hurling rocks and flaming projectiles at castle walls, and they fire him back into the castle. Back into the castle he had just escaped from. The chronicler Froissart reports this with the straight face of a man who has seen quite a lot of things in his time. Modern historians generally consider the story probably apocryphal, or at minimum heavily embellished human bodies launched by trebuchet, do not, as a mechanical matter, tend to arrive in usable condition. But the fact that the story was told and retold and eventually illustrated in Froissart's chronicle tells us something true, even if the specific incident did not happen exactly as described. It tells us that people in the 14th century understood at a gut level that intercepting a message was a form of power, that preventing communication was itself a weapon, that cutting the connection between a besieged garrison and its potential relief was not a secondary tactic but a primary one. And they felt strongly enough about this to produce, or at least enthusiastically repeat a story about the most dramatic possible form of message interception. The trebuchet as metaphor for what it meant when the message could not get through. What actually happened next is worth knowing because it is better than the legend. Another messenger got through. Someone else unnamed in the sources lost to history as so many messengers were found a different route, a different time of night, a different combination of luck and nerve, and the message reached Derby. Derby moved quickly and quietly brought his force of 1,200 men in a night approach and attacked the French camp of 7,000 as they were eating their evening meal. The result was one of the more spectacular upsets of the 100 Years' War. 1,200 against 7,000. The French commander killed, 9 earls and viscounts captured, the French army destroyed. And Froissart records that afterward Derby held a dinner in the recovered castle and invited the captured French nobles as his guests. The generosity of the aftermath was by medieval standards entirely normal. The captured nobles would be ransomed and the ransoms would be enormous. Derby reportedly used the money from this campaign to rebuild his palace at the Savoy in London. But in the middle of all of that, between the failed first messenger and the successful second one, there is a gap, a silence, a period during which the garrison at Oberroche did not know if anyone was coming. That gap, that silence, was the most dangerous thing in the whole story. Not the French army, not the trebuchet, the absence of a confirmed reply. Let me give you one more case. One that is quieter than a battle but cuts deeper, I think, because it is more intimate. The year is 1368. The Black Prince Edward, eldest son of King Edward III of England, is governing the English territories in southwestern France. He is at this point already ill. The illness that will eventually kill him in 1376 has been with him for some years, flaring and receding, affecting his ability to campaign. He is also at this moment making one of the most consequential diplomatic and military decisions of his career. He's preparing to intervene in a conflict in Castile supporting Pedro I, against his half-brother Henry of Trastamara. Letters are going back and forth between Bordeaux and the courts of Castile, Aragon, Navarre. Negotiations over safe passage, over logistics, over the specific terms of the English intervention. The timing matters enormously. Armies do not wait indefinitely. Political windows open and close. One of the key negotiations involves safe passage through the mountain passes of Navarre, which is controlled by King Charles II of Navarre, a ruler of notable political flexibility, let us say, who had been negotiating with both sides of the conflict simultaneously. The letters sent to Charles about the conditions of passage were carried by messengers across a mountain range into a kingdom whose allegiance was genuinely uncertain to a king who was actively communicating with the people on the other side. Some of those letters, historians believe, were seen by the wrong people before they reached Charles. The negotiations that followed were tortured, complicated by the possibility that what had been written in confidence had already been read by those it was intended to outmaneuver. The English eventually got their passage. The campaign was launched. Pedro was briefly restored. But the window of trust had narrowed, and the political cost of that narrowing was real. Here is the thing about all of these stories that I keep coming back to. In every one of them, the actual failure is not dramatic. There is no single moment of sabotage, no villain who stands at a crossroads and deliberately prevents a letter from reaching its destination. There is the road, the weather, the enemy patrol at the wrong moment in the wrong place, the messenger who was caught not because of a systemic failure, but because of the accumulated small misfortunes of travel in a world with no margin for error. And I think this is actually the most honest and most important thing to understand about the medieval communication system as it actually functioned. It was fragile. Not in its design, the design was often remarkably sophisticated, as we have seen, but in its execution. Because the execution depended every single day on specific human beings in specific physical places, doing specific physical things through weather and danger and exhaustion, and the simple bad luck that waits for everyone who spends enough time on difficult roads. Can I ask you something? Think about the last important communication you sent or received. Something that actually mattered. A message about a decision or a relationship, or something that had consequences. Now imagine that the only way to send it was to put it in someone's hands and trust them to carry it on foot or horseback through whatever the world had waiting for them between you and the person you needed to reach. No backup, no way to verify receipt, no way to resend if it failed, just a person, a road, and the hope that they arrived. That was the only option for every letter in this story, for every alliance, every declaration, every message that held a kingdom together or let one fall apart. All of it riding on the specific physical reliability of specific individual human beings, doing an impossibly difficult job in conditions we would find unrecognizable. And somehow, far more often than not, they got through. The story we have been telling across these hours is at its heart about the people who held the world together by carrying its words. And now we are arriving at the last chapter. Not the most dramatic one, the most human one. What happened to these people at the end of their careers? Where did they go when the rides were over? What did a life lived on the road leave behind in a person, in a family, in the thin documentary record that is all most of them ever got from history? That question is quieter than anything else we have discussed. And in that quiet, I think, is where this story finally arrives at its truest point. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a life when the work is finally done. Not the quiet of rest exactly, not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of a body that has travelled a long way and arrived somewhere it does not entirely recognise. The last ride of a medieval messenger was probably not dramatic. It was probably just a ride that ended, and then he realised somewhere in the days that followed when the next commission did not arrive, that the rides were over. I want to sit with that for a while. Not with the drama of the road or the politics of the courts or the seals and ciphers and treacheries we've examined together, but with the quieter question of what was left. What remained at the end of a life spent in motion for a person whose entire professional identity was defined by going somewhere? The historical record, as we've noted throughout this journey, is not generous with its attention to the ordinary lives of ordinary workers, but it does contain traces, fragments that, if you look carefully, sketch the outlines of a human life behind the professional one. In the English royal household accounts from the 13th and 14th centuries, there are occasional entries, brief matter-of-fact embedded in the accounting language of a bureaucracy that wrote everything down without particularly caring about the human dimensions of what it was recording, that mention aged messengers. A grant of a daily allowance to a messenger by reason of his long service and his age and infirmity. A note that a particular named individual who had served the crown as a messenger for many years had been placed in the care of a religious house at royal expense. A record of a small pension, not large, not generous by any modern standard, but real and documented, paid to a man who could no longer ride. The late medieval period did recognise the concept of retirement in a limited but genuine sense. Historians who have studied old age in late medieval England note that long service to a great institution, the crown, the church, a major noble household, sometimes resulted in formal acknowledgement at the end of a career. A room in a hospital or almshouse, a daily allowance of food, a small annual payment, not wealth, not commemoration, just the acknowledgement that you had served and that you were now done, and that the institution owed you at least the minimum dignity of not being left entirely without support. For the messengers who had served long and well, who had accumulated years of demonstrated loyalty and professional reliability, this was sometimes available. For those who had worked more informally, or whose service had been briefer, or whose patrons had died, or whose institutions had changed, the ending was quieter and harder. What did they look like, these men, at the end of their rides? We know from the physical demands we have already described that the body accumulated the work. Years of riding left marks, the spine, the joints, the hands, the particular wear that comes from a life spent on horseback, in weather that did not accommodate human comfort. A man who had spent 15 or 20 years as a royal messenger was, by the standards of the time, not young. The average life expectancy figures for medieval Europe are somewhat misleading because they are heavily skewed by very high infant and child mortality. Adults who survived to their 20s and 30s had reasonable prospects of living considerably longer, but living longer in medieval terms was not the same as living without physical cost. The work had taken what it took, and I find myself wondering, in the way you wonder about people when the records run thin and imagination is the only way forward, what they did with the memories, because that is what would have been left in the end after the official assignments ended. Memory. The roads remembered in extraordinary specific detail. The particular turn of a mountain pass above Lyon in October, the smell of it, the way the light changed as you descended toward the valley. The monastery outside Florence that gave you shelter in a February storm, the name of the monk who brought you bread, the quality of the silence in the guest house before dawn, the faces of kings and bishops and great lords glimpsed briefly across a room. Not as personal acquaintances, these were not men whose social world overlapped with any of that, but as professional witnesses. The expression on a king's face when a letter was placed in his hands, the shift in a room when the news was good. These memories were not in most cases written down. They were carried, held, eventually slowly released into the air as the people who held them grew old and finally stopped. And the roads they travelled, every road they travelled, every time they travelled them, became a generation or two later simply the roads. Roads that someone else would use for purposes entirely removed from what they had once carried. I want to tell you something about what happened to the messenger profession after the medieval period. Not because it ended, it very much did not, but because of where it went. In 1516, Henry VIII of England formally appointed a Master of Posts, establishing the first systematically organised postal network in England, along the roads leading out of London. This is generally considered the origin of the Royal Mail. The Royal Mail, which still operates today, still delivers letters and packages across Britain, and whose informal motto about neither snow nor rain nor heat nor darkness still echoes the words Herodotus wrote about the Persian royal couriers 2,500 years ago, is a direct institutional descendant of the medieval messenger service. In France, Louis XI had established a royal postal service in 1477. The House of Thurn and Taxis, a noble family who managed postal networks across the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, the Italian states and the Low Countries, operated one of the largest private courier networks in European history from 1512 onward. At its peak, their operation employed 20,000 messengers across multiple countries. 20,000. The descendants of the anonymous nunci and cursores of the English royal household working at continental scale. And then in 1860 in America, the Pony Express, that romantic brief 19-month experiment in relay mail that covered 2,000 miles between Missouri and California, applied the same principle that the Mongol yam had perfected 6 centuries earlier. Fresh horses, fixed stations, a relay of riders, each carrying the message one leg of the journey before handing off to the next. The same logic, different continent, different century, same human need. And here is what I think about when I consider all of that inheritance. Every email you've ever sent, every text message, every video call across an ocean, every notification, every piece of news that arrived on a screen before you had walked to the kitchen to make coffee. All of it is the current form of something whose first form was a person. A person who memorized a message in a candlelit room and set out on a dark road. A person who hid a letter in the lining of their coat and walked through enemy territory with the weight of it pressing against their ribs. A person who tied themselves to a saddle in the pre-dawn dark and rode until they could not ride anymore, and then handed the message to the next rider and watched them disappear into the distance. The need they were serving, the fundamental human need to reach someone who is not in the same room as you, to make your voice travel further than your body can, is the same need that built the telegraph and the telephone and the internet. We did not invent communication. We inherited it, and the people we inherited it from were not famous. They did not have titles. They did not write the chronicles. They appeared in the financial accounts, in brief entries in the lists of household personnel, in the occasional note about a dangerous road, or a notable delivery, or an aged man who could no longer ride. They were in the most essential sense the infrastructure of civilization. An infrastructure, as I said earlier, is noticed only when it fails. The thousands of times it worked the letter that arrived, the alliance that held the warning, that reached in time the love that crossed 300 miles of winter road, those moments are in the silence between the records. But they happened, again and again and again, across thousands of years and thousands of miles. Someone got on a horse, or stood up from a bench, or pulled on a cloak in the grey light before dawn, and carried something important from one place to another, and the world moved because of it. Let me end with one last image, because I think it is the truest one I have found in all of this. It comes from the moment we began with the messenger on a road alone, somewhere between where they started and where they are going. Not arriving, not departing, in between. That in-between space, the road itself, the miles between the sealed letter and the person waiting for it, is, I have come to believe, where the real story of this profession lives. Not in the drama of the court, not in the danger of the ambush, but in the ordinary, extraordinary fact of a person choosing every single day to show up for the invisible work that held the world together. We do not know most of their names. We do not know what they dreamed about. We do not know if they loved the road or hated it, if they found the freedom of it intoxicating, or the loneliness of it corrosive, or if, like most of us, they held both things simultaneously in a complicated space that did not have a clean answer. What we know is what they did, and what they did was carry the words between people who needed to reach each other. That was the whole job, and it was enough to hold civilizations together. My friend, we have spent a long time on this road together. We have walked out of candlelit rooms and crossed mountain passes and ridden through storms and stood at palace gates and waited heart-pounding to find out whether the news we carried would be welcome. We have met the women of Ypres who walked through enemy territory 11 times in a summer because their city needed them to. We have watched the Mongol riders bind themselves to their saddles and disappear into the steppes at a speed that the medieval world found almost supernatural. We have sat with Richard Savage, former groom of the buttery, on the morning he was first given a sealed letter to carry on behalf of the crown and told to ride. These were not famous people, but they lived remarkable lives. And I genuinely believe that one of the most valuable things history can offer us, one of the most quietly radical acts available to any of us, is to turn our attention deliberately away from the people history already celebrates, and toward the people who made the celebrated moments possible. The messengers made the moments possible. They deserve to be known. Before I let you go tonight, and I mean that gently because I do hope you have been somewhere comfortable and warm through all of this, I want to thank you. Not in a formal or performative way, just genuinely. You chose to spend several hours with this story, with people history forgot, with a profession that left almost no monuments and very few names, and a legacy so thoroughly absorbed into everything that came after it that we stopped seeing it entirely. You kept listening, and that means something. If this kind of story moves you, if you find yourself lying there in the quiet thinking about the messenger on the road, about the sealed letter, about the particular loneliness and freedom of a life spent in between, then I would love it if you would leave a comment below and tell me what stayed with you. One detail, one moment in the story that you will carry with you. Because here is a truth I have come to hold: the best thing a story can do is not to be finished. The best thing a story can do is to keep going in the mind of someone who heard it long after the telling is over. If this one does that for you, even a small piece of it, even one detail you will mention to someone tomorrow without quite knowing where it came from, then everything we have done here together was worth it. Like this video if it reached you tonight in the way I hoped it would. Subscribe if you want to know when the next journey begins, and take care of yourself. The road is long, but it is worth travelling. Good night.